Majestic mountains, in the middle of a clearing, two men are standing with a shovel and a flag in their hands. It has a black and white pattern on it. One of them was named Kim Soo Ho. At the feet of the men stood cute little creatures saying short phrases. Oh no, here the man's name is Baron Frontera. Royd swings a shovel, aiming at the spot. The shovel is firmly embedded in the ground from Frontera's confident movement. A large blue digital grid spreads across the lawn from the point of impact. It is so large that it reaches the foot of distant mountains. This is the story of an ordinary civil engineer. Particles from the grid are transformed into a digital model of a metropolis. This engineer has completely changed the world. All those present watched this fascinating process. Royd turned to his assistant Gabriel, excitedly telling him that it was all money. Royd laughed out loud, which led Gabriel to believe that he was now crazy. A few years ago, when the city was at dusk, Royd received a message congratulating him on being chosen by the Absolute and having the right to make a wish. The man was lying with his head on the table and noticed the message. It went on to say that he had become one of the heroes of the novel The Steel Knight. Royd was surprised because it was the same novel he had read yesterday. The message ended with wishes of inspiration and good luck. The man is puzzled because he's not even drunk enough to dream about it. Could this be an out-of-body transference, which is so common in web novels? Is he really in another world now? Royd was lying on the ground in the suburbs, but why did he wake up from falling to the ground? He sat up and felt a strong cold chill on his body. His face twisted in confusion as he wondered what was happening to his mouth. The message was about a change in condition, namely a curvature of the mouth as a result of sleeping outside. Royd had already realized this and was getting annoyed by the messages. He realized that he had inhabited the body of the novel's hero. But who did he become in the Knight of Steel? A man who lives in a village and sleeps on the road. Suddenly someone called him master. He was approached by a man in a suit who had been looking for him for a long time. Royd noticed that he had a sword hanging from his belt. The moon was shining on the stranger's light hair. He said that he would be better off returning to the estate. The stranger turned out to be the protagonist of The Steel Knight, Gabriel Azrahan. Royd was sweating because he looked exactly like the pictures in his novel, and also because of his name. As the story progressed, Gabriel became the most famous swordsman on the entire continent. But at the beginning of the novel, he is just a knight who guarded Baron Frontera, and also the name of Baron Frontera's eldest son. Did he really mean to say that he was the same prankster, Royd Frontera? The men stood opposite each other, and Royd did not hold back his discontent. Gabriel denied it, even though he said his name, but did not say that he was a prankster. But it's good that he's judging himself correctly. Message: Gabriel looks pleased, and this makes Royd even more angry. In the middle of the forest there is a wealthy mansion, and it's evening. Gabriel lights the fireplace and tries to find out why Royd was lying on the road. After all, the day before he had been drinking since lunch and broke all the dishes in the inn. And then he got homesick and fell asleep on the road. As expected on a prankster's day. The Baron began to worry and sent Gabriel to fetch him. However, even if his son was a prankster, the Baron would feel bad if he was gone. Royd sat on the bed wrapped in a blanket and remembered that there was no heating. Gabriel recommended that he rest, and he would report to the Baron in the morning. When the servant was leaving, Royd turned to him. With a smile he asked if there was much light in their house. He was surprised by these strange words and left the room. Royd sat on the bed and watched Gabriel slam the door. Royd tilted his head in thought, because he knew the whole story. After all, he read the last chapter lying in his narrow room. Therefore, he knows what fate awaits the swarm. At the very beginning of the novel, the Baron and his wife came across vile robbers. In an instant, they lost all their wealth and decided to commit suicide, holding each other's hands. Meanwhile, the swarm begins to beg and drink alcohol incessantly, thus repeating the fate of his parents. The man was annoyed by the fact that although they were aristocrats, their lives were as insignificant as in Korea. Was it the Absolute or someone else who was up to something? He received a message that he had been chosen by the Absolute and had the opportunity to make a wish. But why did he put a man in this body? The next day the weather in the city was beautifully clear. The sun was shining through the windows of the Fronter's mansion. In the hallway, a worried mother of a swarm named Manhwa Frontera was walking with Gabriel. The mother wanted to know what had happened at the inn yesterday. But Roy denied it because he had been reading a novel that evening. The mother asked her husband to go and apologize. Roy immediately agreed to take responsibility for what he had done because it was his body for which he was responsible. Reports that the mother and Gabriel are surprised by this reaction. The sun was at its zenith. An old man standing in the street was barely loading hay into a cart. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to the men passing by nearby. Gabriel and Roy were walking casually down the street. Roy also noticed the loader, who for some reason suddenly hid behind the cart. The men were puzzled by this reaction. As they continued walking, they noticed that all the passers-by were trying to run away from them. Freud was very concerned about this. A little boy looked out of the window of one of the houses. His father suddenly grabbed him and told him not to look at him. The man immediately closed the window. Roy received a message that the villagers hated him, and he realized it himself. But why was Gabriel following him? The servant refuted that he had to guard him and keep an eye on him so that what happened yesterday would not happen again. But not to protect him, but to protect the residents from him. After all, the swarm is kind of a scoundrel. Moving on, the man thought about the fact that he needed to clean up his image so that he would not go hungry in the future, or at least somehow to deal with the family debt. Then, as the heir to the village owner, he could live in prosperity for the rest of his life. Looking at the messenger, Roy tried to find some kind of cheat and found out what functions it had. He received a message about Roy's skills, namely, being a naughty and drunk. After all, he knows how to make others nervous and become a dog after drinking. Roy was very annoyed by this and started waving his arms as he walked forward. Gabriel called the owner and asked where he was going. After all, the inn was here, and was what he wanted to apologize for a lie. Roy replied that he was just thinking. Gabriel looked into the owner's eyes with a serious look. He stood there, not understanding anything. The servant sighed and asked to enter the inn. Roy cautiously opened the door and looked inside. At that moment Gabriel realized that something was wrong with him. It was as if he had become a different person. There were pieces of broken wooden furniture on the floor of the tavern. There was a crack on the wall with a bull skull hanging next to it. Roy sat down on a chair and told the owner that he wanted to apologize to him for his mischief. There was a report that the owner of the inn was on alert, but the owner asked the host to stop with a trembling voice. Or maybe he was even more frightened because such a lowlife as Roy spoke with respect. Then he decided to change his tactics and speak a little rudely. Although this is an improper manner of a person who apologizes. However, the innkeeper said that everything was fine and he did not have to apologize. Roy was embarrassed by this answer. White clouds slowly floated across the sky. Walking along the road, Roy noticed that even after apologizing, the owner's face did not look good. Gabriel agreed with him. After all the dishes and furniture that he had broken were purchased with hard-earned money that should have been compensated. Roy was angry because he was already in debt and could not even look good in the eyes of the tenants. If he didn't pay off his debts, nothing would happen. But how? Gabriel added that due to the cold winter, the health of the innkeeper's mother deteriorated, and Roy also made a mess. Roy recalled that it was cold in the tractor, and one fireplace could not cope with such a building. It will be difficult for old people to survive in such cold weather until a floor heating system is invented. Suddenly, the swarm stopped in his tracks. His face showed that he was concentrating. An image of a light bulb appeared in his mind. It was as if a current was passed through it and it lit up. Then the man felt something. Something came to his mind. The light bulb began to emit bright electric discharges. In the owner's eyes was a previously unknown realization of something. And then an idea came to him. The light bulb emitted extremely strong electric discharges. They turned into green particles that flew in different directions, forming complex structures of blocks. Royd realized that there were no underfloor heating systems here. And if you create one in this world, it will definitely sell. For the foolish Baron Frontera, this was not even a dream. But for the real Soo Ho, who was in Royd's body, it was possible. After all, he was a civil engineer, and while in the army, he tried to build a house on his own. Day and night, he worked hard on construction sites. That's right. This is exactly how he would pay off all the debts of the Baron's family. Royd was full of enthusiasm. He turned around and told Gabriel that they were going back to the inn to get the first order. The man received a message about the beginning of his real journey. And he also received points called RP for relationships with others, which are currently 0. Royd thought about what he read in the messages. He thought that it was some kind of experience, even though nothing was explained to him. A new message came that he would be able to get RP by improving his relationship with the main characters. Suddenly, the rogue noticed that a blue sign appeared above Gabriel's head. It indicated the level of interest in the swarm was -30. Most likely this is a low level. The man turned to the servant with a smile. He wanted to increase the interest by complimenting the servant. But this reduced Gabriel's interest in him by 1 point. Having been defeated, the man decided to postpone the matter for later so that it would not get worse. A sign for a beer tavern. Royd carefully filled out the contract, naming the innkeeper as the customer and himself as the contractor. He also specified that all construction costs would be deducted from the amount of compensation for the damage. Royd held out his pen for the owner to sign, even though he didn't believe him. He was not satisfied with this problem of distrust. He couldn't ruin his grand plan from the start. He did not want to use this method. So he decided to talk like a jerk. Royd said that they should trust each other because they would see each other here often. And it worked. The tractor driver immediately signed the contract, even though it was a real rag. Nevertheless, the first contract was signed. Royd was pleased with his plan and assured the owner that he would not regret it. There were white fluffy clouds in the sky. Going out into the yard, Royd shared with the servant that there was no need to make precise calculations, since his plan was not perfect. Gabriel turned to the owner. He called the signing of the contract through blackmail a new level of arbitrariness. Royd gave the servant a suspicious look. Royd assumed that Gabriel did not think logically at all, and was not familiar with the concept of cognitive distortion, which meant that if it was like this in the past, it will be like this in the future. This occurs because brain cells contain bad thoughts and stereotypes. Gabriel rephrased it as experience and statistics. But experience and statistics are all in the past, aren't they? Gabriel didn't understand what was happening. Had he ever been so clear before? The servant looked at his master, who said they would smile. Both the innkeeper and his mother would laugh with joy. Royd began to dig with his shovel. He believed that this smile would be the foundation of his livelihood. He dug, carried, tamped, and repeated everything over and over again, while the servant silently watched. He took lumber from a warehouse on the estate and built a central wooden frame as a foundation. This was a traditional Asian method of building from dense wood. Then he applied river clay, and the hull was ready. Royd lay exhausted on the ground, chastising the weakness of his body. Gabriel was surprised at the speed of construction in 3 stages, even though a week had already passed. He seriously wondered where Royd had learned to build. Had Baron Frontera really decided to honor the agreement? The owner stood bent over in pain in front of the new building, but there was no time to rest. Completely exhausted, he still had to cut the wood. With the last of his strength, the man took a swing. and he felt as if something was holding his hands down. Gabriel grabbed the handle of his master's axe. Roy did not understand this gesture and was surprised. But when the servant took the axe out of his hands, he realized that he intended to help. Roy said that he needed boards measuring 2 to 1 heel, showing the approximate parameters with his palms. Gabriel confidently throws a few logs up. He makes a clear swing and aims with concentration. And with skillful movements, he chops the logs into smaller pieces in midair. Neat, finished boards of the right size fall to the ground. Roy stands in a stupor with his jaw open from the show he saw. He shows his appreciation for Gabriel. The man considers the servant to be a true sword master who does not need any modern devices. He approaches him with his hand on his shoulder. With a smile, he says that when he is done, he can help him with the digging. Gabriel is shocked that the owner doesn't thank him and makes him work. He had already forgotten about his character. Roy thought that he helped him out of interest. He would definitely cheat someone someday, but how? The man wanted to finish the job as soon as possible to see the result. To do this, they had to work together. Gabriel was embarrassed by his host's approach. But he thought that although Roy had changed in recent days, he still could not trust him. He could only test this by completing the construction together with his master. Sweat ran down Gabriel's forehead as he continued to dig diligently. Roy, though tired, kept up with his servant. The earth was flying out from under their shovels. And at one point Roy stopped, raising the shovel above his head. It was firmly embedded in the ground as his feet ran. Both men stood side by side and looked at the finished house. Roy confidently announced that the construction was complete. Gabriel asked what kind of hieroglyph was depicted on the roof of the house. He replied that it was the logo of his brand. Roy decided to arrange a check. How exactly he had deceived the innkeeper. The servant did not understand how this would happen. There was a dense forest nearby. From there, the man brought wood and lit a fire in a special hole in the house's foundation. Smoke came out of the chimney on the roof. The innkeeper and his mother enjoyed sitting on the warm floor. All the tendons in the old woman's body could finally rest. The innkeeper could not believe that this was possible. Roy was pleased, because the people of this world could only wonder. Because this power of floor heating is almost like magic. The innkeeper sincerely thanked the owner for the smile on his mother's face. Gabriel was dumbfounded that they were smiling just as Roy had said before. In one morning, he changed not only his behavior but also his work ethic. He also fulfilled the agreement. Was it all for the sake of seeing smiles on these people's faces? It was impossible. Roy is not that kind of person. But he saw the sincere, warm smiles of satisfied villagers. They were really happy. Roy received a message that Gabriel's interest level in him had increased by 2 points. Now it was -29. And because the relationship with him had improved, Roy received 36 points. The man was happy to read all this. He assumed that Gabriel's opinion of him had changed. In any case, the first order was fulfilled, despite the fact that he was in the red now. After all, he built this model home to advertise his services. A few days later, there was a line of city residents waiting outside the new building to try out the new development. Everyone left saying that they had almost melted. Roy was sitting at the table next to him, offering everyone to make such a room in his house. He offered 2 models to choose from, with the possibility of either completing one room or rebuilding the entire house, adding a discount. The peasant was confused because he did not trust Roy. The man decided to reiterate that they needed to trust each other. He also proved to the potential buyer that such a price was almost nothing. Suddenly, someone approached him. It was his father, Baron Frontera, who was interested in what his son was doing. The level of interest in Roy was -20. The man did not expect to see his father here. The estate of the Frontera family. In the middle of a large room at a long dining room table, Roy was having lunch with his father. The man looked at his father. He had been avoiding him so much, and now if he forbids his son to build, What will he do? The man's thoughts were interrupted by his father, who said he was ready to hear Royd out. The father wanted to know what he had come up with this time. Royd said that the innkeeper had given him an order to create floor heating, and he had fulfilled it. And now he makes contracts with other residents of the town. But for his father, the townspeople are very important and valuable, and he will not forgive deception against them. Royd assured his father not to worry, even though no one believed him. With that, the man decided to leave. My father assumed that he was doing this because of the financial situation in their family. After all, he has eyes and ears, and he must have already realized everything. The father assured his son that he shouldn't worry because he would solve the problem himself. At that moment, Royd remembered something. He had heard these words before. When his father had said that everything was fine, and that he shouldn't worry, that his main concern was his studies. Royd really thought that everything was fine. So he said it was a lie and nothing was wrong with them. He didn't want to be miserable because of someone's bad money. Royd supported his father, and said he would try his best too. A few years ago, he should have said those words to his father too. Walking down the corridor, Royd counted the number of orders and the deposit he had already received. And then he met two men in the corridor. They were two loan sharks. Their names were Methoff and Silo. The men passed by and did not even greet the Baron's son. Royd was interested in their behavior. They went into his father's room. The moneylenders expressed their dissatisfaction with the delay in payment of more than 5 days. They said that if they continued to delay payments, they would not sit idly by. Arcos was embarrassed. Silo suggested that if they sold the items in the house, the money would come. A swarm was watching through the doorway, just in time. The moneylenders appeared just in time. The swarm's RP was 36 points. He got a few points by improving his relationship with Gabriel, but he didn't know where to apply them. The messenger explained to the man that he could invest the points in talent and thus improve his skills. The messenger started downloading. A shining blue circle appeared under the man's feet. It began to reveal the man's knowledge of mechanics, soil hydrology, structural mechanics, water supply systems, and the design of steel and concrete structures. The messenger was surprised at how much the swarm knew. Based on his knowledge, he could improve some skills for 15 points each. The man did not quite understand what was going on here, but he would have plenty of RP, so he tried to improve his knowledge in 2 skills at once. First, he gained knowledge of basic topographic surveying. His eyes shone with green light. He did not understand what was happening. Opening the window, the man realized that even without using GPS, he could calculate everything himself using his own eyes. Then he acquired the skill of basic level design. It was a great help, because only recently he had been struggling to draw a project on a piece of paper. In the future, it will certainly be much easier for him, but will Gabriel's help alone be enough? If only he could get some heavy equipment. The messenger encouraged the man by telling him that he had something. Royd could not believe it. He was given a random choice of a phantom partner who would help him with everything. The man was skeptical. In order to start, he had to give 50 RP. The man was annoyed. He did not have enough points, and he had only 1 time left. Royd seriously thought about the phantom. After all, if this is what he thought, then their combined strength would be equal to that of heavy machinery. He needed to collect the RP. And to do this, the man had to get the main characters to be interested in him. The moneylender banged his palm on Baron Frontera's desk. He wanted to tell him a way to get the money if he didn't have a penny. He suggested selling his wife and children, for which he could get a lot of money. Arcos was furious at this suggestion. After all, even though he was a creditor, he still had to keep his decorum. Suddenly, a moneylender came into my father's room with a sack behind his back. The moneylender was surprised to see the man. However, when he found out who he was, the moneylender tried to hurt Frontera's son by pointing out his ill-mannered behavior. Royd boldly asked the men to show him their invitation letter first. The men did not understand what he was talking about. Royd supported his words with an article from the kingdom's basic law. It was about protecting the interests of the aristocracy. And in this situation, their visit without an invitation letter was defined as an invasion. The outraged men began to shout that he was talking nonsense and that no one had ever heard of such a law before. In order not to be unfounded, Royd suggested that we all check the law together. The man called for a servant. Gabriel went into the Baron's room. He was ready and had his hand on his sword. Royd angrily ordered him to cut off the invader's hand. The men were completely frightened, assuming that he had gone mad. Ross suggested that they check the existence of such a law. But whose side the court would take? Gabriel holstered his sword. The sick men were amazed and puzzled, but they had not expected such a turn of events. The frightened men left threatening problems for the swarm. They intended to make him regret his actions. The door slammed loudly. Royd was proud of his triumph. The father turned to his son and servant. He asked what was the meaning of what they had just done. After all, this was a situation where they had to be persuaded on their knees. Royd silently handed the sack to his father on the table. The man admitted that at first he wanted to get the entire deposit and give it to his father. However, this amount would be enough to pay off the interest this month. The father thought his son had collected the money from the townspeople. But Gabriel told him that the Baron shouldn't worry about it. After all, he would make sure that Royd fulfilled the terms of the contract. Looking at the servant, the father realized that Gabriel trusted the swarm completely. It was time for the men to leave. They walked along the corridor of the estate. Gabriel wanted to know how the swarm knew such laws, because in his opinion, he was short-sighted. He replied that he had heard it somewhere, and it was absolutely true. After all, Gabriel said it in the novel. After the Baron and his wife decided to pass away, then these two moneylenders wanted to get and sell their bodies. And it was then that Gabriel reminded them of an article from the basic law of the kingdom. Saying these words, he took their lives with his sword. And in court, he was fully acquitted. For Royd, knowing the content of the novel was a big plus. In any case, he was expecting a new message from the messenger. At that moment, he received a message that Baron Frontera's interest in him had increased by 6 points. Having improved his relationship with the main character, he received 60 points. Now his total number of points was 61. Everything went exactly as he had planned. The Phantom was already waiting for him. The full moon was shining brightly in the night sky. At dusk, Royd stood on the training ground preparing for something. Looking around, he made sure there was no one around. The messenger offered him a random drawing of a fantastic creature. One attempt was equal to 50 RP. The man began the process of random drawing. Suddenly, a green flash appeared next to him out of nowhere. Its particles formed into gears that rotated as a single mechanism. Expanding the space between each other, they created new elements. Royd watched this action with fascination as if it were magic. The green particles formed into some kind of spell. This small mechanism only made an unpleasant noise. And then a bright light began to emanate from the middle of the light circle. The light turned into the face of a small hamster-like creature. Royd was puzzled by what he saw. The little creature jumped to the ground at Royd's feet. The hamster looked happily at the man, its eyes sparkling. The creature was tiny compared to Frontera's height. The swarm called the creature some kind of nonsense. The hamster was extremely offended by this, and his eyes filled with tears. When Royd was about to leave, the rodent began to make indignant noises at the man. He asked what the hamster could do, and if he could demonstrate it. The hamster pointed to its cheeks with its paws and started chewing. Suddenly, he spat out a crumpled piece of paper. It turned out to be an instruction sheet for a litter box. It said that the litter box was a cute hamster that needed to be taken care of with love. Also, along with the instructions, there were colored sunflower seeds that could change its structure. The red seed made it possible for the pallet to grow giant for 12 hours. and the blue seed allowed the pallet to become small. It had to be given to the hamster before the effect of the red seed wore off. A set of 2 seeds cost 1 rupee. The man wanted to know if the hamster could grow to the size of a human. But since the hamster could not speak, he had to test it himself. He thought that if hamsters are good at digging, then if it became the size of a man, it would be a very useful helper. Royd gave the hamster a red seed. The hamster ate it in a flash. Before the man's eyes, the hamster began to grow in size. It was so big that it was resting on the swarm's face. Suddenly, the man flew several meters away from the powerful push. He could not believe what he was seeing. The hamster was at least 10 meters tall. He looked down on the swarm. A message came in about a padong skill, namely level 1 digging. The swarm only managed to shout the rodent's name as it began to dig rapidly. A message about another hamster skill, level 1 earth fortification. The hamster laid down on the ground and began to spin from place to place. Another skill, first level cheek puffing. The hamster stood there with its cheeks puffed out, looking at the swarm. And in a flash, he spat out a giant boulder right in front of the man. The boulder was bigger than the swarm. The man was amazed and satisfied at the same time. He had finally solved the problem with the heavy machinery. But if he appeared in public with this magical hamster, people would become suspicious. In the end, he decided that he would simply carry a book of callings and call himself a genius recruiter. And then, he would deal with the problem of workers for large-scale construction. White fluffy clouds floated across the sky. Another ordinary quiet day in the city. Royd stood on the beach with a team of workers and asked them to repeat after him. That safety was the most important thing. All the men were sleepy and unfocused. But what could you expect from the 30-man army of the barony of Frontera? He couldn't help but laugh because they answered as if they were soldiers who were paid and didn't work. He wondered why they hadn't been dispersed yet, because the Baron had a lot of debts. That's why they wouldn't get any additional bonuses, because they already had labor. Royd addressed the soldiers to emphasize the importance of their unity and cohesion. After all, the purpose of the army is to accomplish tasks. When he was in the army, they did more digging and weeding than training. Royd then pointed to a pile of earth as an example of his fruitful work that night. Although, in fact, the entire pile was dug up in just half an hour. Their main task was to revive the estate. It was a project of a boiler house for the people of the estate. To build it, they had to move all the earth there. The workers were not motivated by the owner's words, and were afraid of the amount of work. Royd knew he should expect this reaction from them. Suddenly a man approached him. It was a senior knight of the barony of Frontera named Newman. He wanted to clarify what the royalty had ordered his men to do. And also the royalty expected this man to speak. There are 3 knights in this estate. One of them is Newman. Byron and the protagonist of the novel, Xavier Azrahan, obey him. At the beginning of the novel, only Byron and Xavier remained loyal until the fall of the estate. This man was the first to betray and abandon the Baron. Since it was Newman who sold the information about the Baron to the intruder, we owe him a small debt. Royd thought it was not good that such a man was a senior knight. The man asked the newcomer what he thought they were doing. The knight could not believe that the Royd was forcing the army to do dirty work. After all, as a senior knight, he could not tolerate this. Royd called it nonsense because he earns money to cover his debts. And he had gotten the Baron's permission. Newman could not believe how he had deceived his lord and decided to recall the young master's past. The knight believed that he was using the army for personal gain. Royd closed his eyes at this statement from the knight. But after a moment, he smiled and agreed that he was right. He would get it now. After all, it was enough to look at his weak endurance. If he tried to play an online game, he would have failed in a minute. Royd picked up a shovel from the ground. The man swung the shovel toward the Newman. The workers were shocked by his action. Newman could barely shield himself from the clods of earth that flew at his face. The smile on the swarm's face was unwavering. The clods of earth fell on the knight's shoes. Newman was furious. He called the man a scoundrel who tried to spoil the knight's reputation. He considered him a foolish son of an almost bankrupt baron. Royd thought that the knight wanted to throw away his regalia and pick a fight with him. The man picked up a shovel and began to twirl it in his hands. Instantly, he got into a fighting stance and aimed the end of the shovel at the Newman, saying that he was not against a duel. In return, the knight said that he would regret it. A month later, he and the knight gathered for a duel. Gabriel asked his host if he was really sure of his victory. Royd, sitting on his bed, replied that of course not. After all, his opponent is a knight called the Heart of Manhwa and a junior sword expert. And he is just a lazy man who is not able to resist him. In his opinion, this question was not thoughtful on Gabriel's part. The servant could barely keep his hand away from the sword to avoid fighting back. He could not believe that Royd suddenly threw the ground in the face of Knight Newman, and even asked for a duel. He probably wants to be a scoundrel again. But it was he who came up with the idea of making money this way, and asked the Baron for a favor. And then he got into an argument and eliminated him. By this time, he had appointed the knight Baron as a temporary manager, and was in charge of a team of workers. But despite this, Gabriel still did not believe that Royd was unsure about the duel. The servant could barely restrain himself from hurting his master. Royd interrupted Gabriel's inner thoughts by asking him for a favor. He wanted him to teach him how to use a sword. But the servant refused outright. First of all, his main task was to protect the young Master Royd. Secondly, he compared the man to a sack, meaning that if the sack learned a sword, it would be more dangerous for everyone else to be around him. Royd was upset that Gabriel did not want to teach him. So in exchange for fencing lessons, Royd offered to help the servant with his insomnia. Gabriel was shocked to learn how he knew about it. Royd knew about it from the novel, and also about what caused the insomnia. In the novel The Knight of Steel, all knights are divided into 4 ranks. The least expert, the middle, the highest, and the master of the sword. Currently, Gabriel's level is the highest sword expert, and he will soon become a sword master. The reason for his insomnia is his inhuman nerves, which are too sensitive. This is the so-called sword master syndrome. But of course, in the countryside they don't know about such things, including Gabriel. So Royd offered his deal to the servant, because he could see on his face that he was not sleeping well. The servant sighed heavily, and agreed to teach young Frontera. The master asked him not to give in to him. It is clear that Gabriel agreed to this deal because he was sure that his master would lose. After all, he had already tried many things to cure insomnia, starting with cognitive behavioral treatment and ending with aromatherapy. In a moment, Gabriel fell asleep with a pillow in his hands, sitting in his chair. After all, Royd had proven that he knew how to cure his insomnia. It was the first time he had accidentally fallen asleep while studying magic techniques. The 18th magic technique is to read out instructions for iron and concrete structures. That's what really puts you to sleep. Now Royd will master all the fencing skills that Gabriel has. The weather was sunny and warm. Gabriel ordered his master to run 50 laps right now. Royd was stunned. But he obediently turned around and started running. He ran without even complaining. The servant watched the young Frontera's marathon closely. It was not easy, but the boy showed good promise. When he reached the finish line, the tired man asked the servant to teach him something better. After that, he started the second lap of the race. He ran up to the servant again to find out that he doubted that Royd could do it. The third lap was much easier for the man than the second. Most likely, if Royd had started to whine, the servant would have said that he could not do it and turned away from him. Gabriel gritted his teeth and agreed with this assumption. Royd intended to run to the end and find out what Gabriel would do then. A message appeared about the passive skill freakishness as it had risen to level 4. Everyone who saw him thought he was crazy and wanted to hit him. But the swarm denied having this skill. Dust flew from under his feet. In fact, he was very tired, and it would be a lie to say he wasn't. But this was nothing compared to his life in Korea. He had no family to give him warmth. Every morning he opened his eyes to a crowded Gashawon. Every day he carried bricks to the 4th floor of the villa. Every night he loaded trucks with boxes. And all this just to keep from starving to death. Constantly dreaming that someday it would be better. Every time he replayed these words in his head. "Hang in there, Kim Soo Ho, it will get better, you're doing well, just a little bit longer." Kim seemed to be reaching for the cherished star. He froze, waiting for it to end a little more. After all, the star was still so far away. And then it completely disappeared from his sight. Kim Soo Ho was in deep despair and despondency. So compared to that pain and despair, this was nothing. Roy continued to run in a circle. Seeing all this, Gabriel said that he would teach him fencing for his sincerity with him. A note appeared in the messenger because Gabriel's opinion of him had improved by +1 point. But his overall opinion of him was now -28. He also received 18 points for a slight improvement in his relationship with a key character. The total score was 29 points. It was getting dark in the city, and the moon was shining its light through the windows of the Fronter's mansion. Newman was talking to Arcos, expressing his indignation at the actions of his son Royd. His father believed that he had come to his senses these days, although he probably misunderstood him. His moral duty required him not to interfere in the duel. And besides, Royd was to become the heir, so the father asked the knight not to be hard on his son. Arcus asked that he be brought to consciousness, so that he would not be mutilated. Newman accepted the Baron's request. But he doubted whether he could do it during the duel. He intended to end this scoundrel once and for all. And if the Baron began to blow it out of proportion, he would have him and his wife killed by making the crime look like suicide. And then, as planned, he will leave this city to seek a better life. Now, thanks to the young scoundrel, his plan will come true faster than he expected. A month has passed since Newman's last conversation with his father. A dueling arena has been set up on the grounds where Roy trained, with opponents already standing. Sitting at the judge's table, Royd's parents, as well as Gabriel and Baron, were to watch the action. Holding out his sword, Newman asked Royd if he was ready. The young frontier stood with a shovel in his hands. Throwing it upside down, the man slung it over his shoulders and confidently announced his readiness. The man smiled and ordered the knight to get ready to receive the full measure. The audience was shocked that the swarm would fight Knight Newman with this. The knight's eyes were filled with indescribable anger and malice. Gabriel explained that the shovel was made of metal he had ordered from a blacksmith. The father was ashamed of his son because he took it as a joke. Gabriel didn't think it was a joke because he remembered what the owner had been doing for the last month. He did general exercises early in the morning and did not complain. Then he went to the construction site to explain the instructions for the boiler room to the village engineers. And then he practiced with his sword as long as his legs kept him moving. This was not the will of a man who was just joking. The servant was sure that Royd was completely serious in his intentions. And then Arcos began to announce to everyone that the duel between Frontera's swarm and the knight Newman was starting right now. The knight took a defensive stance with his sword pointed at his opponent. The swarm held a shovel in his hands and smiled slyly at his opponent. Gabriel noticed his host's foolish stance. Immediately Newman swung his sword at the man, believing that he was mocking him. Royd was calmly and confidently waiting for the right moment. A moment before the blow, he managed to jump aside. Arcos and his servant were genuinely surprised by this reaction. However, Newman did not give up and made a second attempt to assassinate him. But the swarm skillfully deflected this blow as well. It was an incredible and effective technique. This is a special technique that was used in real battles. It was as if his sword skills had instantly improved after all these years. Newman stopped in surprise. Although Royd did not see anything strange in this, because in Korea every man can do it. It was a modern hand-to-hand combat technique, a bayonet attack. And then the roller strikes the opponent a strong blow, which literally knocks him down. After all, this shovel is capable of anything. He can even use it as a shield to protect himself from sharp blows. Another blow to the Newman side, but it missed the target. Then Royd decided to do something else. He put his feet on the shovel, and now he could jump on it. The knight was puzzled by this behavior of his opponent. Gabriel thought that he was really joking. But the swarm was determined. Perhaps he was not joking after all. Newman rushed into the fight. The first weapon that Royd prepared to deal with Newman was a shovel. The second was the basics of fencing that Gabriel had taught him. The knight could not understand how the front became so strong. After all, he was a drunk and a lazy man. And the third thing that Royd used was the synchronized ability to control the tool. He had the first level of digging. The man had to become one with the shovel in body and soul. The level of synchronization between them would increase. Gabriel's opinion of him increased by +1 point during the training. The defense and the baronesses who saw their son sincere for the first time in his life, it increased by +2 and +3 points. And during all this time, he accumulated 97 points. The messenger suggested that he learn an additional digging skill worth 40 RP. Royd mastered a pretty cool skill, so he didn't think about giving up. Steam came out of the Newman's nose. He had no choice, so he realized that it was time to use something that could not be used against an ordinary person. A blue magical glow began to appear around the man. Gabriel suspected something was wrong. The Newman's body was filled with magical energy that was concentrated in his chest. When he saw this roll, he realized that the knight was being pumped with mana. This is the heart made of mana. Newman completed the pumping and took the sword in his hands. Now everything was serious. Royd silently waited for what would happen next. The knight was furious. Sparks flew from his eyes. He made a powerful swing at Royd. Gabriel knew that it took at least 5 years to develop a mana heart. Therefore, he believed that the young master would not be able to block such an attack. The knight's sword almost touched Frontera's body. The parents screamed in fright to the knight. Freud was worried, but did not give up. Newman was eager to finish off the young Frontera right now. The mother and father of the swarm froze in anticipation of horror. But their son, along with his shovel, was able to withstand such an incredibly powerful attack. Newman did not even have time to understand how the opponent was able to resist him. He felt as if all the strength he had inside was leaving him. This was the fourth skill that Royd had prepared for him. It was the mana that made Gabriel Xavier the strongest character in the novel. It was the Azrahan core technique. Through a connected sword and shovel, the Royd was able to take all the mana into his body. The knight could not believe that his mana was drained. Frontera concentrated as never before, and made a powerful swing with the shovel. It entered the knight's face like butter. A snow-white tooth flew into the sky. Before Newman could recover from the blow, another one flew out of his mouth. It was his tooth. Royd dealt another epic blow to the knight with the handle of the shovel. And then, raising it high above his head, he threw a humiliating look at his opponent, who could no longer resist. Newman was completely frightened by the man's skills. Finally, the powerless knight fell face first to the ground. All the spectators were shocked by this outcome. Arcos and Gabriel looked at their swarm with pride. Everyone thought it was crazy, and no one could believe that the young master of the swarm had defeated the Newman. The Baron made an announcement that Frontera's swarm had won the duel. Lying on the ground, Newman thought about how this scoundrel could defeat such a master swordsman as he was. Royd approached the knight to emphasize once again that he had defeated him. Let's just say he was shaken up. Suddenly, the man raised his shovel to give the knight one last good punishment. The toothless knight froze lying on the ground, waiting for Frontera's actions. The father turned to his son to understand what he was doing, since the duel was already over. But the young master did not care, because the time of reckoning had come. The father turned to his son with horror on his face to stop him. The guards ran up to the swarm and pulled him away from the knight, asking him to stop. Byron thought he had gone mad. Gabriel also assumed so. Royd calmed down and asked the guards to let him go. Newman covered his head with his hands and lay motionless on the ground. Finally, the guards and the owner stood calmly next to the knight. But a moment later, the swarm broke loose and began to beat his opponent on the back. The guards tried to stop him, but their efforts were in vain. Gabriel thought that if he looked closely, he could see that he was beating him so as not to hurt him too badly. At the same time, his face was completely calm, as if he knew in advance what would happen next, and as if he already knew everything that would happen. 15 days before the duel, Royd asked his servant to teach him the aristocrat mind technique. Gabriel was surprised by this request, but Royd saw nothing wrong with it. After all, in addition to assimilating magma, it can attract mana from the things around him and turn it into his mana. The servant was seriously puzzled as to how the master knew this. This was a technique he had always kept secret, and it had not even been finalized yet. Royd refuted this by saying that Gabriel himself had talked about it on the day the master helped him to sleep. The servant didn't understand how he could know about a technique that didn't exist. Gabriel refused to teach him the technique. However, Royd said that he would help him complete it after he had learned it. Seeing the overconfidence of the sword master, his servant agreed to see if it was possible. Royd stuck his sword in the ground. The man suggested that perhaps his mana heart was sucking in mana from the outside by itself, and as a result, it bounced off. The young frontiersman realized that from the point of view of his heart, the external mana was something foreign. But if the source is changed, the mana he absorbs from the outside will not mix with the heart of mana. So it needs to be allowed to connect separately. It has to be rolled up and used. He compared it to an auxiliary engine that was near the main engine. After all, they make up one whole, but at the same time work separately. Isn't it cool? Gabriel was sure it was possible, even though he had no idea what an engine was. Royd was excited because he had just imagined it, and it seemed to work. The look on his master's face told Gabriel that he clearly knew something. That's how he managed to complete the aristocrat mind technique that had been bothering the servant for a long time. Since his first attempt, the number of contours he could create had increased to 3. If he continues to practice, he will be able to reach 4 or even 5 contours. There was a report that Gabriel Savier's opinion of him had increased by +5. These words worried Royd, because he wanted to master only the part about sucking up the mana he touched. Gabriel had expected him to defeat the Knight of the Newman, since the young master of the swarm had this ability. But his victory was triumphant. Standing up, his father shouted at the swarm to stop and not to spoil the knight's reputation. The man stopped and was embarrassed. He was surprised by the words about the knight's reputation. To question his father's words, he asked him to look under the tablecloth on the table where he was sitting. Arcos lifted the tablecloth and saw a pile of envelopes with letters. The stunned father began to study their contents. Royd explained that these letters were from Towards, the scoundrel who had been damaging the Baron's estate all along, and they were sent by this knight Newman. There he told about the events in the estate, what the Baron liked and disliked, and how to forge property documents. These letters contained everything they had managed to share. Newman was shocked by this because he had kept his letters safely hidden inside the walls. Later in the novel, Xavier would find them anyway. And last night, Royd sent a peddler to fetch them, who promptly fulfilled his errand. Arcus was stunned by what he saw and heard. As expected in the novel, he was described as a good man. There would be a great uproar if they did away with him now. The Baron felt sorry for him, but the words good leader and good leader mean very different things. Royd offered his help in getting rid of the man. He thought a good punishment would be to have an angry rat put on the knight's head. And then he would be chased out of the manor, mutilated by rats. Or he could be reduced to the level of an ordinary soldier and given the opportunity to correct his actions. People were outraged by this proposal, saying that this could not be done. Arcas decided that this was really too harsh a punishment for such an act, so he would be given a chance to reform, but it would be the last warning. Byron also agreed with this wise decision. And a good warning for other people, too. Everyone agreed with the Baron's decision. Royd asked Newman if he had any objections to this. He replied that he did not, and thanked him for his mercy. The young Frontera was touched by the words of mercy. After all, if everyone treats criminals well, will they correct their mistakes for the sake of the forgiveness they have been given? It is unlikely. Rather, they will become more confident and try to take advantage of the kindness and mercy given to them. Newman believed that Baron Frontera would regret his decision, because he would definitely take revenge on him and his son. Royd noticed that the knight smiled and said that this smile would be his last. Newman did not understand what the bastard was getting at. The young frontline soldier took out his little pocket hamster, Podong, and happily handed him a red seed. After he swallowed it, Royd threw the furry high into the sky with a cold expression on his face. After all, there is no better way to apologize than that. In flight, the hamster quickly broke the seed shell and ate the seed inside. After the snack, the rodent began to grow in size before our eyes, getting bigger and bigger every second. The man's parents opened their jaws at what they saw. Gabriel, along with Byron, also watched with bated breath. All the spectators and residents of the town were puzzled, surprised, and a little scared. As the giant furry beast approached the ground, the swarm ran for cover, while Newman just sat there. In surprise, he opened his mouth and one eye, because the other was damaged in the duel. The hamster flew at breakneck speed to the knight, who just realized that he should run away as fast as possible. But it was too late. The hamster fell loudly right on the ground where Newman was sitting. The impact created a big dust cloud. The ground around the hamster was covered with cracks and crevices everywhere. Royd felt sorry for the knight, but he ordered him to drive it away. This would solve the problem with the callous person who lived inside the manor forever. It was a sunny, warm day in the city. The giant hamster was busy with important work. His paws diligently and quickly dug up the ground. He dug a canal through the whole street in the city. Gabriel asked the swarm what the Podong was doing now, and he replied that his rodent was preparing to widen the road. Meanwhile, the humble laborers suddenly turned into master craftsmen. Once upon a time, there was a city called Rome. Its inhabitants were very fond of roads. They built a special road system called the Appian Way. This is what they will have to do now. Ruidma intended to start from the Baron's house and end at the eastern hill. Gabriel was surprised by the need to build a road in their town. The owner assured him that he would soon see for himself, as their town would become very popular with visitors. The servant asked where he had learned all this. He wanted to know how he came up with the idea to build a heating system that no one had ever heard of before. He also wanted to know how he had suddenly learned to call on beings from the outside. Gabriel said that it all sounded like magic of the highest level. He also cautiously asked if he was really their true master, the swarm. Frontera received a message of danger because Xavier began to doubt him. The man suddenly began to sweat, and Gabriel perked up his ears, waiting for a logical explanation for his dramatic change. Even when Kim Soo Ho had read about this guard in the novel, he knew that he was quite capable. He could easily guess if there was a stranger in the body of the Baron's son. Then he would definitely end him. After all, this guy is no fun to mess with. But he didn't have to worry about that because he had a special skill for such cases. Royd trained in secret from everyone. His special skill was perseverance. Gabriel believed that his young master used to drink for days on end in secret. But Royd refuted this by saying that the servant was not with him 24 hours a day. Perhaps he had been a real fool and a party animal before. But Gabriel knew nothing about what he had been doing all this time. But how could the master explain his new magic skills? Because even mages with great experience sometimes fail to do this. In his defense, The Royd decided to ask the servant himself how he could handle mana so easily, even though he was barely in his 20s. Perhaps someone had taught him this too. Gabriel did not consider himself a brilliant magician, but Royd tried to convince him otherwise. This dialogue made the servant think seriously. The young front man, using his special skills of quick conversation and persistence, was able to quickly end the conversation and go about his business alone. Royd began to worry about the rapid conversation with the servant. The man approached the Baron Knight and asked him to monitor the progress of the work while he was away. The knight agreed and assured him that he would take care of everything. Gabriel said he would go with him because it was his duty to protect his master. Royd did not object, and at that moment the men set off. They were heading to a place on the trail of an unpaid debt, to the small town of the Redhead's estate. The men saw a wooden sign with the inscription Hotel. Suddenly, a man slammed his fist on the table and started swearing. It was the house of the intruder, Rhodes. He was swearing in his house because he couldn't believe he had lost all his money. He had to make those bastards pay. Another man in a black robe approached him and asked if that was the point of all gambling. After all, that's what he was making money on. Realizing that the man could not pay for his services, he said he was leaving him right now. But the man immediately said that he would pay him, and even more than he had if he stayed with him. The problem was that Rhodes could only make money by deceiving other people. But now there are too many people who want to get even with him. So now the man had to lay low. Hearing these words, Royd thought it was about him, and immediately opened the door with his foot. Rhodes and his partner were stunned by the visit. It was not surprising for the swarm, because they had never seen each other in person before. So he introduced himself so that everyone could understand. Rhodes and his partner's faces showed incredible shock and fear. In a moment, the attacker ordered the other man to run away together. The big man in the black robe picked up the attacker in his arms. And at the same moment, the two of them flew out of the window of the Rhodes house. The man landed in the center of the city holding his boss in his arms. He furrowed his brow to keep himself alert. Opposite him stood Gabriel, sword in hand. The man immediately made a spectacular swing of his sword to frighten the big man. He ordered him to give the Rhodes to them, and in this case they would not harm him. Everything happened as the young owner of the Rhodes said it would. They tried to escape through the window, so the front man ordered the servant to wait here. The big man in the black robe was quite outraged by this, and asked if he knew how to use a sword. His eyes turned white, and a black and red blob of magic spun in his hands. After the Baron's death, Xavier only wanted revenge. He fought a duel with a personal bodyguard of Rhodes, the criminal on whose trail he had managed to get. It was also his first battle with a dark wizard. It was not easy for Xavier, but he had to resist the magic of gravity. This is how it was in the novel. Meanwhile, the man in the cloak was launching magic bullets at Gabriel one by one. But thanks to his supreme skill, the man skillfully deflected his opponent's attacks. His dark magic broke up into tiny particles that flew in different directions. Gabriel stood confidently on the battlefield, looking the wizard in the eye. As planned, he had to die. His fist flew into the face of his opponent. But at that moment, the servant was able to stand on his feet. In the novel, Xavier fought the bastard as a mere weapons specialist. When the magician looked at him, he was very surprised. He saw his heart of mana and turned pale. After all, a real Xavier has a heart of mana with a triple ring around it. With new strength, Gabriel took a swing with his sword. He noticed something. Did he have the magic that controlled gravity? Mom had no choice but to point her fist in Gabriel's direction. But in a moment, he was in the air, even though they hadn't agreed on that. Rhodes only had time to reach out to his assistant to stop him, but he was faster. Gabriel turned to Rhodes and asked him if he knew what happens when someone cheats honest people. The criminal was very scared and could not say anything in response. The servant drove the criminal into a dead end, and unable to run, the man fell down and hit the barrels. Gabriel wanted to leave him without legs, so that he could only crawl to court on all fours. Rhodes tried to cover his face with his hand. Gabriel took a swing at the criminal, and at the same moment Rhodes ordered him to stop. The man blocked the criminal with his body, facing the servant. The young frontierman justified his action by saying that Gabriel was not going to act wisely. After all, if he had gone to court without his legs, he would have been punished. At that moment, Gabriel realized that he had almost committed the same crime as this bastard. Would his master now also show compassion for others? The city was silent at night, with only the moon peeking out from behind the clouds. A frightened Rhodes was sitting in his room, tied to a chair by ropes near the table, not knowing what was going to happen next. Across from him, Rhodes sat with a calm expression on his face, his hands folded in front of him. The man decided to encourage the criminal so that he would not be so afraid. After all, when lives are at stake, people tend to be greedy. They will do anything if they get the chance. The criminal did not understand what this man was trying to do. Rhodes shared his thoughts that leaving him without a head would be too cruel. This gave Rhodes hope that he was ready to be forgiven. The young frontline soldier wanted to make sure that he returned all the money. Rhodes was happy and agreed to do so, on the condition that he first receive forgiveness. The owner graciously agreed that receiving forgiveness was the meaning of their existence. Rhodes could not fully understand what the man who caught him was up to. But suddenly the Roid wanted to add one more condition. After all, the criminal was ready to do anything for forgiveness and release. He only had to sign the contract brought by the swarm. The man explained that it was a standard labor contract under which the criminal could even receive a salary. But the main nuance was that 80% of his salary was deducted by the owner to pay off the debt. Rhodes was not amused by this nuance. After all, only in 520 years would he be able to pay off the swarm. This was not the best prospect for a criminal, because it was a considerable sum. As Gabriel expected, his host did not come here to sympathize and forgive. But the young front man is not stupid enough to take the life of someone who owes him money. He would not have made such a rash move. He intended to suck him dry until the end of his miserable life. The depressed Rhodes wanted to know why, for the sake of all the good things in the world, they were offering him such a slave contract. These words surprised the young Frontera. They had no choice but to force him to sign the contract. It was time to resolve this issue in court. The criminal signed his slave contract through tears and despair. The sun was gently shining outside. A chariot with 3 men was driving along the forest road. Gabriel told his master that he had managed to get some money out of the Rhodes. It was enough to pay the interest for several months. However, the owner replied that the money would be used solely for construction. In his opinion, 30 workers were no longer enough. Frontera wondered why none of the townspeople responded to his job posting. Perhaps his reputation simply preceded him. A few days later, the men returned to their hometown of Frontera's estate. A sign said they needed labor. They were willing to pay 20 gold pieces each. After a while, a line of eager men lined up at Royd's table. The man was surprised to meet all these people because he thought they hated him. Gabriel was sure that they did, but his owner promised to install the heating system on time and at a low price. He also punished the traitor of the estate by making him appear before a higher court. Royd said he would become a reliable person who could be trusted. He couldn't believe it was that simple. His thoughts were interrupted by a man who was next in line and was interested in the job. The owner showed him what exactly and how to sign. But before that, the man wanted to express his gratitude to the Baron's son. Royd was a little shocked by these words. The man shared that his baby could easily get sick as soon as it gets a little cold. But thanks to the young owner and his system, this year he won't have to worry about it. The man sincerely thanked the Baron's son and made a low bow. Royd was extremely touched by the man's sincerity. he was a little embarrassed because his real goal was to satisfy his own hunger for money. The man added that he had relatives in the Raycon estate, which was nearby. They too would like Royd to install his underfloor heating system in their home as well. For the man, it was the first step to prosperity and expansion in the future. It turns out that all this was not in vain. He immediately thought about raising the price of his services, explaining that it was due to the additional travel costs. His face showed his readiness to take the money right away. This, in turn, worried Gabriel. But the man really needed the means to get all the materials to the site. Gabriel couldn't believe that this whole construction had only one mercenary purpose. Why else would Royd build a road in the middle of the city? Meanwhile, the men reached the top of one of the hills outside the city. While admiring the view, Royd decided to talk to his servant. He told Gabriel that sooner or later there would be nothing left on this mountain. Xavier did not understand what the master meant. He explained that the creation of a heating system would require a lot of money. Therefore, very soon only stumps would remain of the trees growing here. Gabriel was puzzled by what he heard. He did not understand why the owner wanted to continue doing this if he knew that all the trees would disappear. That's why Royd decided to stop the construction of the Appian Way. Instead of using wood, they would start mining coal from a cave near the town. Royd has already started planning how he will sell it at a high price. Because when the news of his heating system reaches the masses, people will simply not be able to resist such an attractive offer. But for the residents of their city, he wanted to make a discount, but a relatively small one. Gabriel thought the owner's plan was unfair and cruel. Does he really think Royd is like that? But if the man refuses to do this, they will not be able to pay the debt for the estate. Gabriel understood this, but still thought Frontera's views were wrong. The servant agreed that they had no choice in the matter. But he still decided to warn his master against it, because the Baron did not know about his son's plans, and if he did, he would not just leave it alone. Earlier, other townspeople had also tried to start mining coal again and again. Royd knew that it all ended in a collapse due to the unreliability of the ground. But the man was positive and believed that he would succeed, thanks to modern technologies for earthworks. After all, he knew how the shield method of passage works. He worked with a movable prefabricated metal structure that ensured safe mining operations and the creation of permanent fortifications inside it. Royd was ready to go because he and Gabriel had great things to accomplish, even though he had no idea about this new and unknown technology. He wanted to see what his radically new master could do this time. The men decided to return home. The entrance to the old cave, which had been used to extract minerals, was almost completely blocked with stones. The cave stretched for tens of meters into the hollow. Suddenly a strange creature came out of the darkness in the depths of the rock. It had long black sensitive antennae-like antennas. Here and there in the darkness, the red eyes of other unknown creatures sparkled. They were giant ants, a whole army of them. Each of them had a strong, pointed jaw and large, shining red eyes. They were all heading to the smell of new prey from outside. Royd clapped his hands together in concentration. After that, he began to create a magic symbol with his hands. He gained energy and transformed his magic into a large beam of light, which the man launched into the sky, saying that he had the best apartment in Cannes, one of the richest neighborhoods in Seoul. The magical stream instantly soared above the clouds, and then it disappeared over the horizon, leaving behind a small star. In a few seconds, the man was standing outside the best and largest house in the richest neighborhood of Seoul. He wanted it to be true, but unfortunately, Royd didn't have that kind of cool skill. In fact, Frontera was sitting at his desk, just drawing blueprints for a plan to create an underground exit using his own magic. He spent a lot of time on it, though. He received a message that he had only one available skill, which was intermediate-level design. He wished that he could hire 100 hardy workers without having to pay them. Although he did like the ability to draw blueprints with magic. Thanks to the incident with the Newman, he was able to earn 639 RP, making a great impression on the Baron, Baroness, Gabriel, and others. He invested these points in upgrading his skills, and was able to acquire new ones. Royd came back to the same cave to determine where to dig. He had one more new mid-level skill available to him, namely underground scanning. The skill allowed him to see only at a distance of 5 meters. That helped him find the right direction to dig. He had only one problem left, which was to drill the passage as quickly as possible. After all, an ordinary person cannot do this, and people quickly get tired of such hard physical work. Potinak could not help with this because he fell ill during the construction of the road. And even if he had recovered, it would have been dangerous to use him because he was too big. But Royd had no other choice. He decided to use the messenger to choose a random mystical creature. After all, the man had enough points to do so. The young Frontera sat dutifully on the road waiting for his new creature from the magic portal. From the magical glow, he could see someone's small head with a bow. In a moment, its smiling face completely emerged from the portal. The tiny pink creature with a bell on its tail fell to the road in front of the man. She came to her senses and looked at her owner with joy, making bell-like sounds. Roddy could not believe that this was the same ruthless machine. Despite its cute appearance, he assumed that it had poison in its teeth. But at first the Podom also seemed so innocent. Surely there was something good to be gained from this little guy. Royd asked if it could grow in size with the help of a red sunflower seed. She confirmed this, and that she also had her own superpower. The man kindly asked her to demonstrate her skills. She smiled in response. A few weeks later, the giant bluebell ate up the ground while moving inside a shield barrel in the cave. In addition to resizing, the bellflower had the first-level earth excavation skill. It also had the first-level soil cultivation skill. Standing behind the giant bell, Royd ordered Xavier to get ready. Gabriel was already sweating profusely, but he was ready with his sword in hand. After all, the second step of the bell shot hot metal. Xavier, on the other hand, used his skill to quickly cut the metal shots with his sword, forming identical tubes from them. Then the brave blacksmiths used tools and fire to turn the tubes into a strong support. The fifth step was to realize the harsh reality. Gabriel didn't understand why a knight like him had to deal with the secretions of a giant snake. Royd confidently led all the processes, despite the fact that he was also completely sweating. He and his team of workers, Gabriel and the snake, moved further and further into the rock. But because of the lack of oxygen, he was starting to feel dizzy. If they hadn't laid a pipe to bring in oxygen, everyone would have passed out long ago. Gabriel said that the owner, like the other workers, needed to rest. Royd refused, because he had to monitor the work process as a supervisor usually does. Although in Korea, managers are all about talking. Sometimes he came across bosses who had never been to their workplace. And at that moment, the young frontline worker promised that he would never be like that and would monitor all the processes himself. Then Royd used his internal scanner to notice something in the rock. It was the very coal they were looking for. He loudly announced to his workers that they had almost reached the goal and that there was only a little more work to be done. The man thanked the snake for the bell because with its help they had completed the job 10 times faster. The owner made an announcement to everyone present that as soon as they reached the coal seam, they would disassemble the shield to expand the space. It was a rather dangerous place, so everyone had to be extremely careful. Suddenly, a knock from the ground behind them attracted the attention of the robot. This puzzled Mr. Frontera quite a bit. Everyone was worried because the ground in this city was strong and should not collapse. The man started his underground scanning to find out what was in the ground. Behind the coal pile, a hole appeared that had not been there before. In a moment, the hole grew larger before his eyes. Suddenly, a giant mutant ant came out of it, scaring the hell out of everyone. Before Royd knew it, the ant had cornered him. Gabriel, unlike his master, was always on the alert. And without any hesitation, he used his sword to cut off the giant pincers of the mutant's jaw. When the young frontman came to his senses, he jumped to his feet and, taking a shovel, desperately ran to the servant's aid. The man used all his anger and strength to finish off the monstrous creature. The mutant was finished, despite the fact that it was much larger than the men. Roy didn't understand how the ugly creature had appeared here, which was not mentioned in the novel. But it was too early for them to relax. After all, it was just one mutant ant, and there was a whole army of them in the crack. The ants were rapidly approaching the crevice, lighting the way with their red eyes. Roy ordered everyone to run quickly to the outside and leave the cave immediately. Xavier bravely confronted the creatures, killing them one by one. Roy could not understand how many of them were left, hundreds or even thousands. If they reached the surface, all the inhabitants of the city would be finished. Gabriel could not hold out much longer because of the lack of oxygen in the cave. Their mine could not be destroyed without explosives. But even if the structure had fallen into disrepair, there was still a chance that ants would get to the surface. Roth did not know what to do. The servant slapped his master to get him to pull himself together, because they certainly didn't have time to panic. Roy didn't panic, he thought, but he didn't have much time. Gabriel could not hold them back for long. The young frontline soldier concentrated and put all the factors together to find a solution. The light bulb in his head was off, but in a moment it began to shine brightly, radiating electrodes in different directions. This is it. The man picked up the torch and turned to Xavier. He told the servant that they would attack and move forward. It sounded crazy to Gabriel, but he thought it made sense. Xavier continued to fight off dozens of ants with his sword. The men desperately rushed forward to attack the enemies. It was already evening, and one of the workers came running to the frontiersman's estate to tell the Baron the bad news. Arcos was extremely surprised and frightened by the appearance of these creatures. The man also said that all the workers had successfully evacuated, but Xavier and the swarm remained in the tunnel. Byron was about to close the entrance to the mine. The swarm's father put on his armor and, together with the worker, hurried to his son's aid. Gabriel continued to destroy the pests in the cave. He did not understand why they should continue to attack the ants as there were more and more of them. Roydna told him to stop talking because he was busy at the time. The only good thing was that the ants did not come out of their holes, even though the situation was terrible. Xavier was almost on the verge of not caring that it was hot, and there was little air, although there were still a lot of ants. He used his underground scanner to get to the bottom of it as quickly as possible. There had to be methane somewhere in this dungeon. After all, coal is a place where methanogens are distributed. Because of this, layers of methane gas were located throughout the mineral veins. If he could find it, he would immediately blow up the ants. The man looked closely at every corner of the cave, and in a moment he did find layers of methane gas. Roy quickly stuck his shovel into the ground. He asked Gabriel to hold them back while he dug. Roy used all his fast digging skills to reach the layer of methane as quickly as possible. The mutant crept up on him unnoticed, but Xavier reacted quickly, removing the pests from their path. Roy continued to dig tirelessly. Gabriel continued to fight off the fierce creatures. Suddenly, a very loud sound echoed through the cave. In surprise, the men quickly covered their ears and eyes. Coming out of the depths of the tunnel, a huge pink ant, 10 times bigger than the other ants, stood in front of the men. The men realized that it was their queen. Only one of its jaws was larger than Xavier's height. Roy hoped that the servant could overpower her if he tried. But Gabriel objectively understood his strength, so he said it was beyond him. But at the moment, they had no other choice. At that moment, the queen attacked Xavier. The man used his heart of mana to try to keep the defense. The queen's size was considerable, so Gabriel had to look for her weaknesses. But for her, his blows were significant. Xavier was trying his best to hurt her. However, This only irritated the queen to keep fighting. As long as he was holding on, the swarm did not waste a single minute continuing to dig. The servant did not spare himself in the fight with the ant. Suddenly, he heard a strange hissing from under the swarm. The man grabbed a torch and ordered Xavier to run to the exit with him. The furious queen followed them. The men saw the narrow entrance they had used earlier. When they reached it, they quickly jumped in. Royd turned for a moment to see where the queen was. Finding the creature with a glance, the man threw his torch in her direction to eat her. The burning torch fell on her head and bounced to the ground. Her ants were frightened by the fire, fleeing deeper into the tunnel. The enraged queen wanted to end the men. And that's when methane gas leaked through a crack in the tunnel, ignited by the flame from the torch. A moment later, a powerful explosion occurred in the cave. The queen was caught in the middle of it. A few meters away, lying on the ground, Xavier covered his master's body to shield it from the blast wave. The ants watched in horror as their queen passed away, burning in a fiery vortex that in a moment covered them as well. One of the stones landed on Xavier's head, but he continued to protect the young Frontera. At the exit of the mine were the workers, along with Baron and Arcos, who also heard the deep echo of the explosion. The father could not contain his emotions and wanted to follow his son. But at the last moment, he was stopped by Baron, saying that he might get hurt. Then, the men were lying on the ground among a pile of stones and smoke. Royd woke up, because his ears heard badly after such a powerful sound. The man got to his feet, and when he saw the queen's head still, he realized that his plan had worked. Royd looked at Xavier and realized that he had protected him. He then picked up the bell and apologized for the scratches he had received from the explosion. The man looked up and saw that the exit from the cave was blocked by stones. This meant that things were bad. Suddenly, the man began to feel dizzy. He received a warning message that there was not enough oxygen in his body. He knew it himself. That is why he needed to get outside as soon as possible. Using his scanner, Royd estimated the thickness of the rubble to be about 5 meters. The oxygen level was getting even lower. But the young Frontera had no choice but to dig for Xavier and the bell. Gabriel came to and saw his master. Everything swam before his eyes. He could only hear his master saying that they had to get out together. Royd said that he would not leave them. At the same moment, Gabriel lost consciousness and fell to the ground. The messenger expressed his admiration for the young frontier because of his desire not to leave Xavier. Then Gabriel's opinion of him improved by 6 points. This brought Royd's total score to 108 points, bringing his total to 157 points. The man was breathing heavily through his mouth, inhaling the last gulps of oxygen, the level of which was at an extreme limit. In any case, Royd had nothing left to lose. There was less and less oxygen. And then the man pulled himself together and turned to the messenger to activate the search for knowledge that could develop his skills. The messenger started processing its own data. It started scanning the man and looking for the knowledge he needed. It found some of it, namely, mana absorption, mana processing, and mana increase. By combining all these skills, Royd could master the Azrakan core technique. This was exactly what he needed. After all, the young frontrunner hadn't stopped training since his duel with Newman. He was confident that he could develop his skills as far as he wanted. The man did not hesitate to agree to receive such a technique, which cost him 15 RP. In a moment, Royd received the Azrahan's core technique in a 5th level single ring. Then a small blue spark appeared in the dark space. It formed a ring that Royd felt inside of him. Unfortunately, he had no mana in his heart, but he could feel the presence of the mana rings. Inside, he had a 120% expansion of mana. Even if he had been an ordinary person who trained hard, the result might not have appeared immediately. But he had a lot of RP, and he could increase his skill level with the click of a button. Royd decided to move forward and bet everything. His Azrahan's core technique in the single ring increased to level 6. There was a 125% expansion of mana. However, every time he clicked on the upgrade, the cost increased by 5 points. Despite this, Royd continued to level up his technique until he reached the 10th level. For a moment, he thought that he would need these points in the future, but he had little choice. He decided to level up his technique as long as he could. His ring of mana that had been revolving around his heart turned into 2 rings of the first level. His mana had expanded by 200%. To increase to the next level, 100 RP were required. But the man had only 7. Royd wanted to know from the messenger how he was doing now, because the number of rings had increased. The messenger informed him that he had 2 skills available to him, such as a 10-minute stretch of life with the ability to not feel tired and an energy burst that allowed him to triple the manga for 20 seconds. Also, these 2 skills had restrictions on use and the amount of 1 time per day. The man accepted this and prepared for a quick dig. Then he activated the skill of the stalker, which allowed him to forget about his fatigue. The man quickly began digging in the direction of the exit. His oxygen level was at an all-time low. In his mind, the man was begging for daylight to show through the crack. He only needed a small space if he could find even the smallest gap. Using his own scanner, the man moved deeper into the earth. The oxygen level was critical. Sweating, Royd stopped because he noticed something. It was the very small crack he was looking for. It was the way out. The earth flew from under his shovel even faster than before. Exhausted, Gabriel and the bell still lay unconscious on the ground. Gritting his teeth, Royd continued to bathe without stopping. The oxygen level was running out before his eyes. Royd dug as hard as he could to save his family and himself. He had enough oxygen for just a few breaths. Meanwhile, there were only 3 meters left to his cherished crevice. The exhausted man fell to his knees in despair. His shovel also fell to the ground without strength. After all, ZHYVCHYK's skill had ceased to work. The man sitting on the ground was on the verge of despair. And that's when he decided to use the energy release skill. Royd got to his feet and picked up a shovel. Every second was worth its weight in gold, so he immediately continued to dig aggressively. His skill only lasted for 20 seconds, and he had only 30 centimeters of earth to dig to the rescue hole. Meanwhile, there was no oxygen left at all. Having dug such a large stretch of earth, he did not have enough air and strength for the miserable 30 centimeters. Royd lay powerlessly on the ground, so close and yet so far from the exit. Royd thought about how quickly it was over. After all, as the son of an influential man, living in a remote area, he only dreamed of a normal, quiet life. It seemed as if the story of his life was over. But suddenly, he heard a strange sound that he had heard before. With the last of his strength, Royd stood up on his elbows to see where it came from. At the same moment, a giant hamster, Podong, who had long been familiar to him, emerged from the ground. This made the man very happy, and made him smile at the furry animal. Royd immediately smelled the fresh air outside. This encouraged the man to get back on his feet. He told himself that the quiet life of a baron's son was waiting for him. It was already dark and twilight had fallen on the city. A torch with a bright flame was burning in the cave. Arcus, accompanied by Baron and the townspeople, moved through the tunnel in search of the missing men. Although the night warned the Baron to move on, he was determined to go all the way. For a moment, the man stopped when he saw something in the depths of the tunnel. A few meters away, the silhouette of a man carrying something on his back was moving toward them. It was a Royd rescuing his humble servant. The use of special skills in an emergency situation helped him surpass any limits of human capabilities. The special case, combined with Azrahan's new core technique, had a great impact on the man. However, after that, a new skill of the 3rd level power mode was available to him. With the help of this skill, The core technique was calculated to be able to operate even during severe exhaustion. Frontera's father recognized his son as a soul and ran towards him, shouting his son's name. Confused and exhausted, the young frontier, carrying Gabriel and the bell, did not immediately recognize his father. When the man ran up to his son, the latter lost all strength and fell into his arms with the servant. It was deep night, and it was extremely difficult for everyone. At dawn, the city was already abuzz with gossip and theories about the latest developments. Two men in the middle of the street were comparing their attitudes toward the young swarm master before and now. One of them said that his nephew was in the very epicenter of the events and saw it with his own eyes. He noticed that when the giant ants attacked people, the owner of the house thought first of all about saving the workers, not himself. It seemed as if the whole town was discussing the exploits of Royd and Xavier. All the residents expressed different opinions and attitudes toward this event, but each of them agreed that this swarm was different from the one they had known before. Meanwhile, the culprit of the gossip was lying in bed in his room under Gabriel's watchful eye. The young frontline soldier needed time to recuperate, but later he opened his eyes. After a long time, Xavier finally saw his master conscious. Royd received a message that the inhabitants of Frontera's estate and the townspeople were deeply impressed by his heroic actions. But whether he would be awake or asleep, the man did not understand what was being said. However, the messenger informed him that he would be rewarded with extra RP points for his outstanding achievements. After this message, his RP scoreboard was updated, and the number of RP points on it was now equal to 507. The man began to realize what had happened to him. He realized that he had become a hero, and in addition to that, he was happy to receive 500 rupiah. The feeling of pride and joy filled him with positive energy. The next morning, the mine was already in full swing. The workers were busy reinforcing the walls of the tunnel and performing their daily duties. Suddenly, a long-awaited visitor caught their attention. Royd Frontera and Gabriel were just returning from the mine when they met the workers. They all paid their respects to the owner and praised him for the fruitful work he had done today. The men looked at their savior with big, sincere eyes. He was different from other nobles, and was a true example of nobility. All the praise and affectionate words made Royd feel ashamed of himself. After all, 2 weeks had passed since the victory over the ants. Therefore, the work in the stone mine was in full swing. Everything seemed to be going well again, however. In such a turbulent time, Royd believed that their safety should come first. He wanted to avoid even the slightest risk of danger. On this day, their main task was to search for ant tracks. Gabriel wanted to ask the owner something, but he insisted that he do it quickly, so as not to waste oxygen. The man asked the swarm why he was constantly putting himself in danger. After all, he could have simply ordered others to do it for him. He believed that it could not be that the owner was only interested in the comfort and safety of ordinary workers. Moreover, as a future heir to the estate, he had to take care of himself and take care of his personal safety above all else. In response to these words, the young frontier called the servant a fool. After all, his real duty was to take great responsibility for all possible risks. Gabriel looked at his young master in embarrassment. Royd explained his position by saying that in this case, even if he threw money around, no one would dare say anything to him. Xavier did not understand whether this was good or bad for him. The messenger informed the owner that Gabriel's level of sympathy was ready to increase, but he suddenly changed his mind. The men reached a blank stone wall. Gabriel suggested looking elsewhere. However, the young frontline soldier was not in a hurry to make conclusions. It seemed to him that there was an empty space inside the wall. Perhaps it was there that the uterus laid eggs, from which new offspring could appear. So the man wanted to verify this theory by digging. And suddenly something surprised him. Inside the wall was a really dense space. The man saw a humanoid green creature with fangs hanging above the ground by its hands, bound by cobwebs on all sides. Also among the victims of the insect mutants were animals wrapped in strong cobwebs. Most of them were horses and pigs. For Gabriel, the green creature seemed dangerous, so he intended to deal with it. It was not a well-considered decision on his part. He wanted to know what kind of creature it was. However, Gabriel explained that it was an ordinary orc. The owner assumed that it was inanimate, but he had heard that ants usually preserve their prey by paralyzing a living organism. This fact encouraged Royd. The man could not hold back his smile, because it was an incredible find for him. On the same day, the men brought a green orc to the Fronter's estate. His name was Garrosh. The orc told the men that Royd was his savior, whom he would never forget. Royd wanted to know why the orc always added a kick at the end of his statements, perhaps in order to match his character more harmoniously. However, the orc did not understand what he was talking about. Garrosh turned out to be the son of an Orcish tribal leader. Thanks to the doctor's care, he quickly regained consciousness. He was the son of the leader of the tribe of Steel Sand, and once again emphasized that he would not forget Royd's kindness, and would generously thank the man with whatever he wanted. Royd was greatly encouraged by these words. After all, he had really saved him. And then the young frontier man would ask the stout orc for anything. He needed 120 orcs to work in the mines. However, Garrosh refused the savior's request. The man was confused and sad. He wanted to know the reason for the refusal. For the orc, it seemed suspicious that the swarm had clucked his tongue, as if he were a bad person. However, the young frontier immediately refuted this as a habit, just like the orc's habit of saying the prefix kick every time. Garrosh emphasized that orcs are warriors who follow only the orders of their commander. And since Royd was not a warrior, he could not give orders to orcs. That was the reason. He had heard before that orcs were supposed to go out into the wild upon reaching adulthood and return with the head of a giant ant. Garrosh said that he had made a mistake when he went to the ant's hive, where he was instantly paralyzed. Hearing this, Royd made a new decision, which made the man lick his lips just thinking about it. The young frontline soldier pretended to accept Garrosh's decision and kindly congratulated him on his coming of age by clapping his hands. But Garrosh explained that he had been on his mission and had not brought the giant ant's head back to the tribe, because it could not move once it was inside the insects. Royd did not immediately understand what the orc was talking about. After all, Garrosh had caught and killed the giant ant with him, and its head was hanging on the wall in Royd's room as a trophy. However, the orc could not remember ever having managed to take out such a large ant. Frontera explained that he did not remember anything because he was unconscious. Royd told his new friend that he had witnessed a fascinating sight. When he got to the ant's hive, he saw the queen shaking with fear. She was screaming that she could not believe she had lost to the young year. Garrosh wondered how the mutant ants could understand human speech. But Royd explained that it was true, because they had made great progress in this skill recently. The man emphasized that it was thanks to Garrosh that it was much easier for him to find their hive. Gabriel didn't understand why the owner was so confidently lying to his new friend about his incredible feats. In general, the man wanted to support the orc, who was embarrassed by his failure, and give him hope for the best. Royd put his hands on the orc's shoulders in a friendly manner to finish his speech in a trusting atmosphere. In the end, the young frontline soldier once again confirmed that they had overcome that giant ant together. After all, Garrosh is an unsurpassed warrior, just like Royd. The orc was sincerely ashamed and embarrassed after such pleasant words in his direction. On this positive note, the man decided to bring up the topic of helping 120 orcs to work again. And this time, Garrosh expressed his unquestioning consent to this. Exactly a week later, the men set out for the sandy valley that lay beyond the green forest on the outskirts of the city. And so soon, the three of them reached the village of the Steel Sand Orcs. Their wigwams looked very interesting, built of wood and bones, and decorated with their national symbol, the coat of arms. It seemed as if the men's long journey in search of labor was over. But the tribal leader and Baroj's father, Akush, regretfully informed Royd that they would not be able to fulfill his request. Royd was shocked that the orcs began to fight back. However, the man did not give up hope and decided to politely ask the chief the reason for his refusal. Akush explained that they were not strong enough to perform this task. They needed to eat meat to stay strong. And if they don't go hunting, their muscles will become extremely weak, and the loss of strength will lead to the decline of their tribe of steel sand. Therefore, they cannot reduce the number of warriors they need to go hunting. Royd interrupted Akush's explanation to ask if they go hunting every day. The chief confirmed that they did, because their muscles would weaken if the orcs did not eat meat every day. Gabriel thought it was ridiculous that the orcs were obsessed with their own muscles. He explained to the owner that for these creatures, protein and muscles are the meaning of life. Therefore, it would be better for everyone to give up this business. Royd heard the orcs' needs and thought about a compromise. So he approached the leader with the idea that if the meat did not spoil for several days, they would not have to go hunting every day. And as a result, they could provide workers for his mine. Akucha agreed with this statement because they wanted to repay the saviors for the return of their son. So this option was quite possible. Royd enthusiastically suggested to the chief that they could keep the meat fresh for a while. But first they had to go back a bit to remember the time when they had first arrived in the orc village. Barosh was crying out for his father's name. Akucha, also in tears, could not believe that he was seeing his son. Barosh ran like hell to meet his father. In return, the excited father ran to his son. People and orcs watched this sentimental spectacle. And at that very moment, the father and son united in a strong embrace, clinging to each other as strongly as possible. This powerful collision in the village of steel sand shook the ground and raised dust. It was just a hug, but the effect was so moving. Roth thought that if he had been standing between them, he would have been ground to dust in a second. And then he realized that if he could attract 120 such brave craftsmen, their production would soar thousands of times. However, there was one more thing that deserved attention. Harash brought and showed his father the head of the queen of the mutant ants. Akucha, along with his subjects, was proud of his son and announced to everyone present that a celebration would be held in his honor. Later, Royd had the opportunity to watch the orcs train with the help of golden items and jewelry. This spectacle impressed the man greatly. After all, they used golden columns as ordinary dumbbells in the gym. The young frontline soldier could not understand what they were doing with these golden things. He had the impression that the orcs were taking them out of thin air, because these precious things cost 10 times more than any other sports equipment. That's why the Great One signed a construction contract with the leader of the Shark. This way, they would get both labor and treasure. The men intended to build a stone-cold storage facility for storing meat. And in return, they would receive various precious items. However, Gabriel noticed that they would need special tools to work with the stones. The servant had never heard of such a vault, so he decided to ask his master about it. Ruth reminded Xavier that royal wizards could keep food fresh with the cooling power of ice magic. A cold store was a place that was used for the same purpose, but without the use of magic. Gabriel was extremely surprised by his master's knowledge, but he was too lazy to explain to his servant what he knew and how he knew it. First of all, they needed granite to create the refrigerator because it is very strong. Roy pointed to a granite rock to make his words clear. Something told Gabriel that it would not be an easy task to get this stone. Roy confirmed his assumption. Although they didn't have any explosives with them, they had a great substitute. The young front man turned to face Gabriel and pointed at him. After all, he already had a man with explosives ready. Xavier guessed that his boss wanted to use him in this situation. This was one of the key moments of the novel The Steel Knight. It told the story of the famous city of Mamaram. It was located on top of a cliff, surrounded by a pink glow. The city was imprisoned inside a magical barrier. At that time, thousands of refugees inside the city were the prisoners that Xavier was supposed to save. By that time Gabriel had almost become a sword master, and his mana heart possessed the fourth mana ring. For some time, he watched powerlessly as the mana was sucked out of the hearts of the city's captives. He had to save them even at the cost of his own life. In this way, without realizing it, he created a new skill of propulsion. His secret was to protect the main heart of the mana with one ring, and to channel the power of the other three rings into a blow of incredible power. Then all the power of the three mana rings passed from the heart into his hand, and from there into his sword. This led to a powerful explosion. As a result of the formation of a large blast wave, Xavier literally flew upwards, and then he fell to the ground. After that, this explosion became the same technique that, together with Azrahan's mind technique, represented the Steel Knight. Royd asked if they could use the same technique now. Instead, Gabriel wanted to know how the master had learned about this theory. Royd said that it was the first time he had thought of this technique, and his eyes did not contain a lie inside. Xavier was annoyed by the owner's eyes, because he saw lies in them. The embarrassed Royd tried not to show his excitement, and asked him to just try it. Gabriel believed that the owner would still do it his way. However, the young frontier urged the servant to always wish each other only good. He also promised to make an effort if Xavier succeeded in his theory. That would be a definite plus for the Baron's son. Gabriel approached the rock to try to apply his propulsion technique. To do this, he needed to protect the mana heart with one ring and release the other three by force of impact. And at the same moment, the man made a decisive sword strike into the granite rock. A bright light began to radiate from the place of impact in a second. Royd thought that Gabriel had succeeded on the first try. From the dust cloud, the silhouette of Xavier was moving toward the host. Coming closer, the man noticed that his outerwear was torn. Gabriel was in a stern mood and wanted to know if the owner had planned this. Royd did not plan it, but he was sorry that it happened. But in any case, Xavier was happy that this time the master's plan worked. Next was the young Frontera's turn. The messenger told the owner that Xavier was grateful for this lesson. Gabriel's level of sympathy for him increased by 3 points. The overall level of sympathy for the host was minus 11 points. He also received 54 RPs for improving his relationship with a key character. The total number of RPs was 561 points. Gabriel shared his thoughts that the master knows his skill and should use it to protect the Baron. But now he uses it for construction. Royd took these words as gratitude from his servant. But that was not the case at all. Since then, construction has progressed much faster. The granite that Xavier split and shaped was delivered to the construction site by a hamster called Padong. The orcs tried to free people from hard physical work so that they would not break their backs, even though no one asked them to do so. But the orcs, who were addicted to training, were doing all the work themselves. After all, lowering and lifting large granite blocks was like a normal workout for them. Royd assumed that at this rate, they would finish the construction 5 times faster. For the next stage, they only needed ice and insulation. The man asked Xavier how long it had been since he had sent his workers to get the insulation material. He replied that it had been exactly 3 weeks. They should have been back by now. Gabriel assumed that either their soldiers were too lazy, or something else might have affected their speed. Royd thought that something might have happened to them on the way back. The man got up from the stone to find out what had happened to his soldiers. But Gabriel stopped him from doing so. Xavier offered to go in search of the soldiers himself if that was the only task. He believed that the owner should not go with him, because they could not know for sure what had happened to the people. However, Royd reminded him that they had already discussed this topic with the servant. The young frontman again explained that he was responsible for organizing the construction, and therefore was fully responsible for his workers. Gabriel had no choice but to exhale and agree with his master on this point. The men immediately set out on the road. They passed through sandy rocky areas where there was not a single living thing or plant. Suddenly Royd noticed a lost glove of one of his workers in the sand. It was one of the gloves he had recently ordered for his men to use when working with insulation. While the man was looking at the glove, Gabriel noticed something else. Xavier showed his host a crevice from which a very strange atmosphere was coming. Royd did not understand what was so strange about this crevice. But Gabriel explained that the mana flowed here in a rather unusual way. Everything was somehow blurry and imprecise. The young frontiersman thought about the servant's words. He remembered that he had already encountered something like this while reading a novel about the Knight of Steel. After realizing his own memories, fear appeared on Royd's face. The man ordered Xavier to leave the place quickly with him. Gabriel did not understand his host's reaction. The swarm anxiously told Xavier that most likely their soldiers were no longer alive. Gabriel was both surprised and frightened by his host's words. Later, after a difficult journey through the rocky terrain, the men reached the foot of a strange gorge. Royd noticed small piles of straw near the entrance to the cave. The man took a handful of straw from the ground with him, which surprised Gabriel a bit. The young frontline soldier tightly gripped the dry grass in his hand and prepared himself for any circumstances. Royd explained to Xavier that they had reached the Ruffulon Gorge. After all, at the very beginning of the novel, this place was mentioned as one of Xavier's goals, because it was here that the dark wizard Ruffulon lived. The man was furious that this magician could do something to his soldiers. After all, trespassing on private property was supposed to be punishable. The owner's thoughts were interrupted by Xavier, who ordered him to follow him through the cave. Royd did not have time to stop the servant as he stood on the floor with his foot and caused a strange magical reaction of the stone, which began to shine. Royd barely had time to take Gabriel back by the collar. A moment later, a small explosion sounded where the man was standing. Xavier was amazed that there were magic traps in the cave. Royd asked the servant if he was really a knight, because a real knight should calculate such moments in advance. In the novel, Xavier fell into the same trap when he was wounded and looking for shelter. But his Gabriel never repeated his mistakes twice. And then the knight rushed to the exit of the cave. Since the flow of mana in this city was unusual, Royd suggested that the man apply his technique here as well. Gabriel knew that in the natural environment mana was in a state of constant uninterrupted concentration in the atmosphere. Thus, he could understand where the magical traps were laid in the skull. It was by sensing a certain unusual concentration of mana in one place. Gabriel listened to his feelings and concentrated. In a moment, he was already leading his young master forward. Royd noticed that the servant's senses were quite well developed. As Gabriel walked cautiously forward, he thought that Royd was only doing what he was doing, lying to him and insisting. But now everything is different. Xavier did not understand what was going on. After all, the young front man had somehow predicted various events before they happened. But how did he do it? Gabriel did not feel any special energy from him, although on the other hand it could be a very powerful mana. As a result, the man came to the conclusion that first they had to deal with what awaited them ahead. They needed to save all the prisoners as soon as possible. A few meters away, the men noticed a silhouette in a black robe holding a book. At that moment, the cloaked man felt the presence of strangers in his cave and turned in their direction. The man was glad that his trap had worked and that someone had visited him. He was interested in thinking about who it could be. The man closed the book and was sure that he would soon find out for himself. He believed that his preparation was complete. His experiment had to be successful, so he immediately opened the bolt on the stout metal door. Behind it, on the stone floor, young Royd's workers sat tied up and frightened. The magician chose one of them, and, at the prisoner's begging, dragged him by the scruff of the neck into another room. In a moment, the laborer was lying inside the red magic circle depicted on the floor of the ceremonial hall. The magician had everything he needed for the experiment: a magic circle, a ruthless scythe of a priest, and most importantly, a young human life. The man sharply swung the scythe at the worker. He screamed and cried pitifully, waiting for his end. And at the same moment, behind him, the magician heard a voice addressing him. The dark wizard turned around in surprise, and was shocked by what he saw. Royd and Xavier addressed him, and ordered the man not to touch their worker. The magician was not happy with the intruders, because he could not understand how they had avoided his traps. Worried for his safety, he quickly began to lower the metal gate with the help of magic to prevent the men from getting inside. The metal curtain dropped sharply in front of them. Behind the men, too, white, thick smoke began to pour out from under the cracks in the metal gate. Royd inhaled the remaining fresh air and held his breath to avoid falling into the dark wizard's new trap. Royd had managed to hold his breath, and so he felt confident, but Gabriel did not. The magician intended to put the guests to sleep with sleeping magic in order to deal with them later. When the space between the two metal walls was filled with sleep magic, Royd used his Zichic skill. He got 10 minutes to not feel tired at all, although he was sure that a few minutes would be enough. After all, he was not in an ant tunnel now. Xavier had never taken medication to treat insomnia, so no sleeping pills were going to work on him. Royd had already gone too far. He dug a rather long tunnel that ran under the metal wall in the direction of the magician's hideout. Gabriel noticed that his master looked like a mole with a shovel, and he would laugh at this on occasion. Royd gestured for Xavier to go downstairs to him. As the servant tried to apply his driving technique, the young front man crouched down with his ears covered. Gabriel concentrated the power of the mana rings in his sword, and with all his strength he struck the ground. This caused a great explosion. When he saw it, the mod did not know what to do, because he was terribly frightened by the skills of ordinary people. His face was full of horror. When the dust settled, it was possible to see a hole in the ceremonial floor of the magician. The hand of one of the men appeared from there. It was a swarm holding onto the stones and climbing to the surface. He crawled slowly toward the magician with an unwavering fury on his face. He had never seen such a large monster before. The wizard kept his magic ready to repel the intruders. With a sharp movement, he directed it all to the floor. In a moment, a giant, terrible two-headed giant appeared from the magic glow. Even though his experience had been a failure so far, it was his most powerful creation. It was virtually invulnerable, with only its steel armor worth a damn. Its giant arm was approaching the men. Roy told Gabriel that it would not be easy for them. He also tried to tell him that his weakness was his legs. But Xavier immediately desperately rushed into the fight. Xavier used his propulsion technique again, but this time in the fight against the magical giant. With his sword, he created a powerful tornado wave that covered the monster's head. In one incredible move, Gabriel split the magician's creature exactly in half from head to toe. The magician's face was full of horror and shock. He could not believe that this was really happening. Royd was no less surprised by this result than the magician. Royd could not believe that Gabriel had used the power of the explosion as an auxiliary force, which gave him the opportunity to split the monster in half. But for some reason, his novel did not mention this technique. Meanwhile, Gabriel stood calmly over the body of the defeated giant, sword at the ready. Fearless and proud of themselves, the men stood in front of the magician, staring unwaveringly ahead. The wizard trembled before them and realized that no matter what he did, he could not defeat them. Royd sat down leaning forward and spoke disdainfully to the magician. He told the man in the cloak that due to the disappearance of his workers, the construction of the young Frontera had stopped. And since it was the work of a magician, he had to pay Royd back somehow. The magician decided to lie down on the ground in order to survive in any way possible, and to apologize for his evil deed. However, Royd was not interested in his words at that moment. He wanted to receive compensation for the damage he had caused. Realizing the man's intention, the magician said that he had many valuable things that he would give them. This greatly amused the young Frontera's inner greed. Going to the storeroom where the prisoners were kept, Gabriel told the owner that the soldiers were very exhausted, but their lives were not in danger. Royd was pleased with this news. Royd tried to ask the magician why he needed all these people, because in a few days they could have been dead with such an attitude. The magician was dumbfounded, but still dared to tell the man his plans, as they would not become a reality. The magician told him that he was conducting unusual experiments to find out how to bring people back to life. Royd furrowed his brow and asked the man why he needed to do this. Sitting on his knees, the magician was extremely touched and saddened by the man's words. After all, he was doing all this to find a way to get his wife and son back. Royd thought about it, because he did not expect that the magician could have had a family before. The man said that he used to be a magician in the estate of a baron. He lived an ordinary life with his beloved wife and son. Although no, his life was not ordinary, it was happy. But one day the baron, whom he had served so faithfully, suddenly wanted to take his wife away from him. So on the same day he tried to escape with her and his son. But the baron still pursued them. At this point, the swordmaster interrupted the magician's sensitive story, explaining that he did not believe the man's words. After all, if he had saved his wife and son, while taking the lives of hundreds of innocent people, it would have been very cruel. And his family would definitely not have thanked him for such a salvation. As well as for the ruthless creatures he created, the lives and happiness of the families of those people whose lives he took. Royd believed that his story did not deserve pity. Gabriel took all the soldiers out of the storeroom, and noticed that no matter what the magician told them, his true gut could not be changed. Xavier tried to suppress the magician by telling him that it was he who had broken the happy lives of many families, and that he would remain who he really was. Endless hot tears rolled down from the magician's eyes. Royd was glad that at least he could still cry. The man told the magician that he would soon return with reinforcements to his cave to take all his magic and precious things. And if he tried to harm anyone else in the meantime, he should not expect forgiveness this time. The magician was extremely shocked by the man's verdict. In the end, he bowed to the men and thanked them for their kindness and humanity. Then Royd remembered that in the novel, Xavier also forgave the magician, and he later left the cave. But after that, the magician took the lives of hundreds more innocent people. He even conducted an experiment on himself. He turned into an uncontrollable and annoying thief who challenged Xavier again and again. And even though Royd knew about it, he turned his back on him to make sure of his assumption. At first, the magician stood motionless and just cried in front of the man, but as they were about to leave, the unexpected happened. He suddenly looked at the men from under his cloak, planning something insidious. The magician's eyes concentrated on the negative that came from his gut. Seeing Royd's alcohol, the mage felt that he still had a chance to get back at them and destroy them all with the use of dark magic. The magician was rapidly approaching the man and could already taste his own victory. However, at the same moment Royd turned around, looking into the magician's eyes. He said that he never forgave him. The magician wondered how Royd had learned about his intentions and true identity. The man knew in advance what he would eventually lead them to. For Gabriel, this meant only one thing. He had to give the magician a chance to think about his actions. And in the same instant, with a sharp and as always precise sword movement, Xavier beheaded the magician. Then she flew off swiftly to the side, and his body remained motionless. More than once in his life, young Soo Ho heard remarks about himself. That he was just a miserable fool who was rotten to the core. There was a man who constantly scolded him for no reason. He called the boy a ragamuffin and ordered him to bend over 90 degrees when greeting him. It was very hard on the boy because it was becoming more and more difficult to withstand the constant remarks. And so it went on and on. While Kim was working at a construction site, the guy reassured himself that there was nothing wrong with his remarks. Later, he tried to restrain himself from quarreling, and then from physically assaulting the offender. The man often said that young people needed to be taught everything because without them, they could only eat on their own. The boy hoped that if he was polite to this man, he would change for the better. Thinking about it this way, he tried to come to terms with the situation. But where did it lead? When he continued to show politeness and tolerance to the man, he continued to resent and quarrel with him instead. He only saw Kim as a punching bag. On that day, the man called him abusive names once again. Kim Soo Ho could barely contain his anger. Soon it would all be over if he held back. After all, if he caused a scandal, he would only make things worse for himself. But in this moment of internal struggle inside the boy, the man added that only a worthless mother could have given birth to such a worthless son, and then laughed. At the same time, uncontrollable rage filled the boy's body. He approached the man and put his hand on his shoulder. And immediately his face changed dramatically. It craved revenge and punishment for the offender. In a moment, his fist entered the face of the man who had been harassing him for so long. The offender was screaming in pain, covering his face with his hands. All the workers turned around to see what was happening behind them. No one could understand what had happened between these men. Then Kim's fist went into the man's face again. And then again and again. Finally, Kim Soo Ho kicked him in the stomach to finally punish the offender. While he was beating him, there was only one thought in his head: that he was doomed. When the man was lying on the ground with his hands covering his head, the other workers grabbed the Kim and prevented him from approaching him. What was the outcome? The man continued to work at the construction site and carry building materials to their destination. One day, in the middle of a working day, he caught sight of a familiar figure. It was the same abuser who had once harassed him. He too continued to work at the construction site. However, when he met him, he hid his eyes and tried to avoid any contact with the guy. The scratches on his face did not allow him to forget the recent assault. Therefore, the man behaved very carefully and calmly towards the boy. As a result, peace came. Sometimes you need to stop any violence against yourself or others. Will everything be fine then? There are a lot of serial criminals in Korea. They usually justify themselves by saying that they were intoxicated and could not control their actions. The guy did not understand why the most violent criminals go unpunished, as in the case of an ambitious doctor and scientist. In this regard, his sentence was revised in favor of him and his prison term was reduced. Although perhaps it was all about human rights. It turns out interestingly. After all, then the thief should get what he deserves. Returning to the city with the workers, Roy thought about this, while the cold body of the insidious dark wizard lay behind him. Meanwhile, the weather was warm and sunny in the rocky valley. Roy, together with his servant and exhausted workers, was returning to his place of work. Suddenly, one of the men began to sweat profusely and breathe heavily as he walked along the path. The young frontline soldier noticed this and became concerned. He asked the man to give him his backpack while he was still able to stand on his own. The laborer was surprised by the offer and refused. However, Roy explained that if the man became ill, he would have to carry twice the weight himself. So he ordered the man to give the load to him. A moment later, the man ordered the other workers to give him their backpacks as well to make it easier for them to walk. Everyone doubted this idea, but Roy ordered them to fulfill his request. While the front man was tying all the backpacks together in a single ball, his embarrassed workers tried to persuade their noble master not to do so. To pacify the workers, the royal said that he would not pay extra money for those who opposed his decision. The man put a huge backpack of backpacks on his back. Behind him, the workers looked at him, puzzled but sincerely impressed by his kindness. Gabriel did not understand whether the owner really cared about the soldiers' well-being or whether it was the backpacks they were carrying. But at that moment, he realized that the truth was not important to the soldiers. For them, he was a trustworthy leader who they could follow anywhere. This is what the soldiers thought of the young swarm leader. Messenger reported for the man that the liberated soldiers were deeply impressed by his actions. And after a while, stories about him will be passed down from generation to generation. Isn't that great? The man thought about the messenger's words. Royd was not impressed because he did not need anything but money. The men were already approaching the village of the powerful sand orcs. Later they managed to complete the construction of a stone-cold storage for food. Harras, along with Royd and Gabriel, inspected it from the inside. The young orc was a little disappointed with what he saw. It was a little cooler inside than outside, and their meat would spoil, and their muscles would lose all their strength. However, Royd decided to reassure the Harash and refute his fears. After all, the work was not yet finished and there would be ice to store the meat. Harash knew what ice was, so he explained its absence in the storage room by saying that it was hot. The young frontier with a smile assured the orc that if there is no ice, you will not be able to make it yourself. The orc was desperate and wanted to know how they could do it. The man assured the giant that they could make it any way they wanted. Harash began to doubt the truth of the swarm's words. But the man just smiled silently at the orc. Young Garash began to doubt whether he had brought a swindler to his village, who was trying to deceive him right now. Perhaps the story about the Ant Queen was a lie. The messenger noticed that Garash was not as naive as the swarm thought. But the man never thought so. The messenger disagreed with this because he thought that the owner really thought the orc was naive and short-sighted. However, the swarm refuted the messenger's thoughts by saying that the level of sympathy, or rather the client, was much more important to him. And at the same moment, Garash remembered that the swarm had saved him, and he shouldn't have thought so badly of his savior. Calmly and cheerfully, the orc headed for the exit, assuring the men that they could ask for help from him any time they needed it. Rhodey thanked him for his concern, and asked the Harras to wait until all the work was done. As the owner stood there smiling serenely at the orc, Gabriel wanted to know where they would get the ice from. Royd froze in place for a moment. Turning to the servant, his face was covered with drops of sweat. He too was wondering where they would get the ice. Gabriel could not believe that these were the eyes of a man who did not know what to do. The servant wanted to know why his master had signed the contract without a specific plan in mind. Was he going to deceive them? And at that moment, Royd asked Xavier to listen to him. He asked the man if he knew the first signs of failure in any business. Xavier looked at the young Frontera in confusion, and did not understand what he was talking about. Royd explained that he might not be able to do one thing or another, but there would always be a bunch of reasons why he couldn't do it. So he asked the servant not to behave like that. After all, without trying, you will not know whether it will work or not. The real success will be achieved by those who are open to everything new and try to fix any situation. This is what he called innovation. The man clenched his hand tightly into a fist to show his leadership spirit, because these were the thoughts of a true entrepreneur. Royd was determined. That's why he stood with his fist raised in the middle of the warehouse in front of Xavier. Gabriel was skeptical of the owner's position. He believed that such an enterprise was more likely to fail than to succeed. Soon it was deep night in the orc village, and a bright full moon was shining in the sky. A swarm was sitting on a rock in the middle of the rocks, thinking about something. The idea came to him that he needed to make a giant cube of ice first. A pallet and a bell would help him with this, as they would bring water from the lake in no time. The man also knew that there is ice magic in this world. He wanted to know what its principle of operation was. He entertained the idea that this technique was based on freely changing the flow of mana. The young frontline soldier was sure that this was possible due to daily training in mana absorption. After all, there were several types of natural mana, and thus, all changes depended on the nature of these manas. The man seriously thought about how to make it happen. But then, he had a very interesting thought. Of course, he could not use the mana in any way he wished. Royd imagined a pallet and a bell carrying the water in cheeks to a giant ice mold. The man could create something akin to ice magic. He wanted to try Azrakan's technique of absorbing mana. After all, if he took all the heat energy out of the water, only the cold energy would remain in it. But then the man accidentally did the opposite, and the energy of cold began to gather around his hands. It was not as easy as he expected. Gabriel watched in silence as the man put his hand into the water. Gabriel remembered his master's words about being open to everything new and trying to fix any situation. Xavier thought that the man's position was rash and irresponsible. But he realized that Royd was really trying to find a way out with dignity. The servant settled on the idea that he did not understand him. Strangely, the swarm continued to sit on his knees with his hands in a giant ice cube tray with water. The messenger told the owner that through the use of the Azrakan mind technique, he had developed a new skill, namely, raising the level of this technique to the second level with double rings. A few days later, the garage and his father came to the vault again to check the results of the swarm's work. The orcs were shocked by the temperature inside the vault. They were literally shivering from the cold, and steam was coming out of their mouths. In the middle of the storage room, on wooden pallets, was a giant ice cube. The orcs could not believe their eyes that they had managed to get it. Roth said that everything would be ready as soon as they installed the insulation on the ice cube. And the heap was happy because there was plenty of space in the storage room to store the meat, which no longer had to be thrown away. The garage was also happy that they no longer had to go hunting every day. The orcs decided to celebrate this event and gather all the people. At this moment, Gabriel watched in shock at the satisfied face of the owner while talking to the orcs. Royd defiantly turned his head to look at the servant. He reiterated that he was thinking like a true entrepreneur. Gabriel agreed and did not intend to argue with his master. A little later, the whole tribe gathered in the center of the Steel Sand tribe. Akucha's leader sincerely thanked the swarm for the shelter. But the swarm replied that he shouldn't thank him because he was only fulfilling the terms of their contract. As a result of which the young front man received 120 strong laborers for his enterprise. However, Akucha said that orcs are different from humans in that they do not do this for the sake of a contract. They do it because they are sincerely grateful to him. And from that moment on, the leader of the Steel Sand tribe promised the swarm one thing. That from that day on, Frontera's family and his tribe would declare an alliance stronger than family ties. Then all the orcs stood in the same position to demonstrate their unity with the swarm and his family. The orc army shouted the words of the leader again. The swarm was a little worried. The Kucha had declared the swarm his friend, and so his enemies immediately became his enemies, and thus their entire tribe. He assured the man that they would come as soon as he needed help. Then the messenger began to load to send a new message to the swarm. He made it clear to the man that the tribe was now available to him. After all, the orc tribe accepted him as a true friend. And now the swarm could strengthen his kinship with them by using the orc's RP. As a result of this event, the young frontrunner received plus 100 bonus RP for discovering the tribe. This brought his total points to 611. For a moment, the man was in mild shock. But a moment later, he was happy to have discovered the Steel Sand tribe and to have become related to them. And so they set off again on a long journey to return home. Of course, the citizens of Frontera Manor were very shocked to see 120 living muscle units arrive in their city. Roy thought that he should write an official appeal to the people to calm the situation down. After all, orcs were often heard of only in a bad light. Meanwhile, the young Fronter's father and mother watched in horror as a bunch of green giants roamed the streets of their city. Even though the Baron was aware of his son's journey, he froze in his tracks as soon as he saw the orcs in person. Moreover, the man did not expect to receive bonus points for helping the giants. The messenger reported that his wonderful story about defeating the wizard and saving the soldiers instantly spread around the city. And the residents of the estate praised the young frontier for his noble courage. After that, the man again received bonus points plus 300 RP for his achievements in society. The total number of RPs was 911 points. The man thanked him for the RPs, but asked him not to praise him anymore. The Baron said for his son that he would look for a wealthy buyer to sell what they had received from the orcs. Then they had only the magic stuff of Ruffilon. The young wizard was sitting on the floor in the room among the magician's things and holding a magic ball in his hand. Gabriel asked the owner if he had found anything worth selling, but the man was trying to figure out what they could use before selling it. Suddenly, Root came across something strange in the magician's magic book. The man told his servant that he urgently needed to go to the mine. The young front immediately grabbed his cloak and the magic book and hurried out of the room, ordering Xavier to clean up the floor behind him. Soon, the man was reaching the entrance to the cave where his workers were mining coal. Once inside, the man sternly called out to Rhodes, who, along with the other workers, was serving his sentence under the contract. Rhodes heard his master and approached him to find out what was going on. The young frontline worker wanted to give the man some good news. He asked if the man remembered the details of their agreement that he had to work for the swarm for 520 years. The man confirmed that he did. But at the same time, the Roid said that it made no sense, because all these conditions were ridiculous. But now, he wouldn't have to worry about anything. Rhodes held his breath waiting for his master's explanation. Royd opened a magic book and showed him how to bring a dead person back to life. Rhodes did not understand what the master was getting at, but Royd explained to him that in this way he would still be able to serve his full sentence. Isn't it wonderful? The man smiled sarcastically and put his hand on the debtor's shoulder. But at that moment, he asked why he was the only one who was laughing and ordered Rhodes to smile a little too. At first Rhodes was embarrassed by his master's words. However, in a moment he understood everything and smiled through tears of disappointment. The cheerful and vigorous swarm continued down the tunnel, wishing the debtor not to get discouraged. After all, it was fun for him. The messenger noticed that the Lord of Darkness himself appreciated his efforts and was already thinking about offering him a job. However, the man did not see anything wrong with that and cheerfully walked further into the tunnel. The messenger did not understand the gesture, but he could not object. The sunlight shone through the windows of the frontiersman's mansion. Roy was walking down the hall toward his father's study to discuss something with him. When he entered the study, he did not find the Baron and was surprised. Suddenly, the man was approached by a cleaning lady who explained that the Baron was currently receiving guests in the guest room. Roy wanted to know who the guests were. They turned out to be the long-time familiar loan shark Salo and the Metropolitan. At first, the man stood motionless looking at the cleaning lady. But in a moment, his face became extremely angry and angry. In the guest room, there was a large chandelier with crystal beads and candles. At the table opposite my father sat the notorious moneylenders. They said that they usually demanded that the debt be covered in one payment. This time, however, they would only allow the Baron to pay 10% of the debt if he transferred ownership of the mine to them. Arcos Frontera thought about the offer with his hands folded in front of his face. The loan sharks asked him why he was taking so long to think about it, since it was the best deal he could get. Suddenly, a young Frontera knocked on the door, introducing himself and asking for permission to enter. The father did not hesitate to allow his son to enter the room. Once inside the room, the man began to talk nicely to the moneylenders. The men said that if he came to threaten them again, it would be useless. They already had a solution. Roy said that from their point of view, a visit with such a good offer was a very reasonable decision. However, he expressed a desire to make a counteroffer to them instead. But one of the moneylenders refused to listen to a fool like Royd. But the young front man still said that in the future they would still pay the debt in installments, although they could really reduce the interest. The moneylender got angry and started shouting at the man that he did not want to listen to him. Royd asked why they were allowed to offer something and not him. This position made the man angry. Suddenly everyone heard a strange voice from the hallway. A giant green orc's foot came into the room. The furious Garrosh asked the audience who had angered his brother Frontera. The moneylenders quickly grabbed each other, their faces full of uncontrollable horror at what they saw. Garrosh told them that his tribe of steel sand would destroy anyone who harmed the young frontier. However, Royd calmly explained to his friend that nothing terrible had happened to him. But the orc noticed that Royd looked extremely angry then. The man said that the moneylender had only raised his voice a little at him. He decided to calm the frightened men down by telling them to ignore the orc. And then the rogue decided to ask them again how they liked his offer. After all, if they refused him, he would be offended to the core. He also added that as soon as they dared to offend the young frontier, he would destroy them right then and there. After these words, the terrified moneylenders quickly fled from the guest room to the street. Roy wanted to make sure that the dead did not exist at all. But as long as that was not possible, he gave his father the opportunity to be satisfied with what he had. The bewildered father agreed and thanked his son. Royd noticed that orders for the system were growing and coal production was in full swing. Thus, they would be able to quickly close the debt. The man handed the contract to his father and asked him not to lose it. The father carefully took the document and made a promise to his son. After that, the young frontier said that they had bigger problems that needed to be solved as soon as possible. After all, orcs consume 10 times more food than people. Therefore, their food costs were no joke, but they could not let them go either. The words of the son caused anxiety and misunderstanding of the situation in the eyes of the father. As Royd had thought, the orcs were excellent miners. Their powerful bodies and muscles helped them to make powerful swings of their picks at the stone, and to cut the small stones in an instant. Their eyes were full of fury and passion for hard physical labor. Suddenly, Roth noticed that one of the orcs was heading into the depths of the tunnel without a reinforcement system, digging a path in front of him at the speed of light. The worker clarified that this orc had been working non-stop for 24 hours straight. Upon hearing this, the swarm ordered several workers to take him away and make sure he did not appear here until tomorrow morning. The furious orc tried to resist the men who were dragging him out, explaining that he did not want to rest, but only to work, because without it his muscles would weaken. Their productivity was 10 times higher than what the swarm had expected, and their endurance and strength defied any explanation. When the young front turned to the garage with a proposal to pay for their work, he said that money was not needed for orcs. On the one hand, this pleased the man. But on the other hand, now, at Garrosh's request, he had only to feed them all enough. This was not an ordinary problem. Royd assumed that as a result they would have to raise taxes very much. After all, they would use the money to buy meat for the orcs. The man explained to his father that because of their natural productivity, they would not go into the red because of such expenses. The father understood his son, but said that he could not be sure that the people of their city would be able to afford it. It was very difficult for him to make a decision. Arcos said that they cannot demand such a high tax from people. He explained that if they keep raising the tax, it will be a real robbery of the people. But they are not losing anything now because they will work harder. They could only suffer losses if the amount of tax paid decreased. The father was interested in his son's words and wanted to know how they could raise the tax for the city's residents. The young front said that it was quite simple because it would allow them to earn more money. The man gave an example of an abandoned land in the north of the city. He suggested turning the wetlands of the Marie's estate into a farm, which they would give to people in return. In this way, they would grow various crops on the farm, earn a lot of money, and pay taxes for the Baron accordingly. The sky was covered with orange clouds, the sun had disappeared behind the horizon, and it was getting dark. Royd walked confidently in his safety shoes across the marshes in the Mara's estate. Gabriel walked behind him. He told the owner that it had been several hundred years since the land had been abandoned. He did not understand how people could grow anything in such a place. However, his big boss had an idea about it. Royd said so, but he didn't deny that it would be difficult. He had to take into account many things because the territory was not small. The family had to think about a system of accurate rainwater drainage. Therefore, the man had no choice but to model a possible option. On the training ground, the man created a reduced model of a marsh in the Mars wetland out of water and earth. Based on it, Roy tried to come up with an experimental solution to the problem. However, his attempts failed time and time again. The man did not give up and continued to work on the model of the marsh, looking for ways to solve this situation. A new sunny morning dawned in the city. Exhausted, the swarm continued to sit in the same place and use his hands to form pathways out of the swamp to drain rainwater. Arcos and Gabriel came to visit their son. He had been at the training ground for 21 days. Xavier asked if he should stop his master, because he had hardly eaten or slept all those days. But his father forbade the servant to do so. Arcos hated him, even though he was his son. He no longer hoped that Royd would ever become a normal person, because it seemed impossible to him. But now the Baron saw that he was trying to bring amazing changes to their city for the sake of other people. Perhaps his father could not help him at that moment, but he was not going to stop him either. Xavier agreed that it was a wise decision on his part. After all, it was then that the young master of the royalty was responsible for his words and never gave up. The man worked diligently to solve his problem, gritting his teeth and forgetting about everything in the world. It was then that the messenger informed the swarm that Baron Frontera's level of sympathy for him had increased. As a result, he received 20 RP and his total level was 931 points. Meanwhile, the trees were covered with evening fog, and it was getting dark outside. The young frontrunner sat in front of the finished model with relief, having found the best solution to remove rainwater from the swamp. He raised his fist in victory, which by then was already illuminated by the moonlight. The man shouted that he needed to suck it in, and then the water would go where it was needed. All this meant that when he figured out the water, he would be able to raise taxes. And then the money of the people of his city would fall on him like a shower. And then the man would have a truly carefree life. Royd could already imagine himself swimming in honey like a bee. But at that moment, he was alone in the middle of the training ground at night. He exhaled and fell to the ground to rest with relief. Royd was extremely exhausted, but he considered it tolerable compared to the way he worked nights and days at odd jobs. Suddenly, a message from the messenger started loading in front of his face. He said that his unusual experience had a good influence on his new skill, namely design. Royd read the information about this skill in the messenger with concentration. There he learned that this skill can be obtained from the personal modeling mode, which in turn is possible by managing the collected data. At the same moment, his visual scanner was used in the man's eyes. Behind him, a digital grid was formed around the rock containing certain data. The man tried to deform this grid in his opinion by increasing the height of the rock. However, the digital model on the grid showed that in this way the rock would collapse. After realizing his new capabilities, the Royd began to scold the messenger for not telling him about it earlier. After all, the young frontline worker had spent a whole month searching for the necessary solution. But the messenger thought that it was normal for him because the owner said so himself. However, the man had something else in mind because he was having a hard time all this time. He also told the man that his skill could become visible through the wisdom he had gained. But in this case, the reason for its appearance was his desire. The man asked what his desire was when he first appeared in this place. He believed that the messenger did not know for sure. He did not understand how his wish was connected to this world. After all, he just wanted to graduate from college, get a license, get a job in a good company, and not think about money. Wasn't that what he wanted? However, the messenger explained that this was only his goal, and his desire was much stronger. It is what overcomes any space and time. The man interrupted the messenger to finish the conversation about the transience of life. He was busy at the moment. Royd got to his feet and called his faithful assistants, Padong and Bell. He invited them to meet their new friends. The magical creatures did not yet understand what their master was doing. The next morning, the sun was rising over the horizon in the Mara's marsh. At the beginning of the swamp, Royd stood with his friends and thought about the steps to fulfill his plan. First, he ordered his little helpers to pump out all the water. The hamster and the snake were shocked by the amount of work, so the young frontier realized that they could not cope with this task alone. Then he put the little creatures on the ground and decided that he would paint. The man intended to use all his RP to create the maximum number of magical creatures. He turned to the messenger to clarify the cost of this service. Royd had to pay 100 RP for one choice of a magical creature. And since the price would increase by 1.5 times each time, he would get 4 new creatures in total. The man immediately pressed the start button because he didn't need any special skills. After all, he needed the same giants as a paddle and a bell to pump out water. The random creation of creatures was very noisy, and everyone was waiting for the result on the sidelines. Suddenly, someone's yellow head peeked out of the magic portal. The creature immediately jumped out of the portal in the direction of the master. Then the yellow ball hit the young Frontera's nose and bounced to the side. It rolled a little further away from the man, who could not understand what kind of creature was in front of him. The balloon turned into a yellow creature with a big mouth that said its name Hippo. Royd was surprised at the name. Could it be a little hippo? The pallet and the bell were happy to have a new friend. Hippo ran with open arms to hug the little creatures. All 3 of them spun in a circle around each other, calling out their names. Then the swarm apologized to Hippo for distracting him and asked to see the instructions. The little yellow hippo immediately spat the instructions out of his mouth. Royd was already used to this. Then the man began to carefully study the instructions for the new assistant. He learned that a hippo will not grow even if it is fed with sunflower seeds. Maybe Royd had made a mistake this time. Meanwhile, the little hippo just smiled sincerely at his owner. The young frontline soldier stood with his arms crossed and thought about something. The hippo stood in front of him and continued to smile at the man. And then Royd decided to turn to the messenger again to try to create the creature again. However, the messenger said that this function was available only once a day. The man said that he was disappointed and wasted his time. Hippo was upset by the owner's rude words, and the bell and the Padon began to protect their friend. The man explained to his friends that there was more and more work to be done, and the hippo was too small to be of any use. However, the creatures did not back down from their position and started a rally against the owner. Then the man agreed with them because they scared him. Royd asked Hippo if he could absorb moisture from his clothes in return. The messenger replied that Hippo had a level 1 water absorption skill. Royd was interested and asked how much water he could absorb at once. Hippo started pointing to his tummy to say that it could hold 4 times as much water as his stomach. Royd thought that so far he had all the skills he needed, so he was lucky. Meanwhile, the hippo was getting ready to show his master his skills. The hippo ran over to a nearby pond and began to gently swallow it. Royd and his friends watched as the hippo slowly drank with a squishy mouth. But soon, unexpectedly for the young Frontera, something incredible began to happen. His new friend began to grow significantly in size. Royd also noticed this change along with the others. The yellow creature continued to squishily suck in water. At first, the Baron's son could hear the squelching by looking down. But soon, he had to look up to hear the hippo. The new friend was 10 times the size of his master. At that moment, the yellow creature had almost completely absorbed the water from the marsh in the Mara's land. Later, the satisfied hippo got to his feet and wiped the last drops of water from his mouth. He made the swarm look like a tiny creature. Only a few small puddles remained in that part of the swamp. The man opened his mouth in shock at what he saw. He could not believe how so much water had been absorbed in such a short period of time. This meant that they could dry all the water from the swamp in a few days. The pallet and the bell looked up at the owner with pride. The man apologized to them and asked the messenger if the choice of creatures was really random. The messenger explained that when the mouth appeared in this world, his skills were manifested one by one. Since his role as a person with a bad fate could have added a lot of unnecessary worries. Therefore, most likely, the man developed the ability to draw for luck. Although perhaps this was not the case. For the swarm, the messenger's assumption seemed a bit rude. Hypo asked the owner for more water. The swarm allowed him to do so because their construction was to begin tomorrow. As the evening progressed, the water in the swamp became less and less. Their construction began with the vertical drainage method. This method involved drilling a well in which water was to accumulate and then be diverted to a spillway. The workers were naturally shocked when they arrived at the construction site and saw the owner's new friend. First, the hypo had to pump out all the water from the swamp, and then drain it into the river and become small again. Next, the workers had to turn the ground and take away the remains of the plants. After that, Xavier used his technique to set off an explosion inside the earth. The men dug holes in the ground where they inserted bamboo poles. Next, they made sand pegs and asked the pallet truck to crush the ground on both sides. As soon as the water collected inside the bamboo poles, the jeepo would make a powerful water punch. Later they built a more secure shelter using young Frontera's modeling skills. 10 days passed in this way. The first part of their construction was completed. They still had a long way to go. But what was waiting for them after all the work was done? Raul had promised the workers to throw a big party. So now they had to do their best. All the soldiers were extremely happy and encouraged by the master's decision. It was a warm day, and a large locust was sitting on a tree trunk near the construction site. Sweating, Xavier watched her silently and thought. Before his eyes, the abandoned area was really turning into farmland. Holding the shovel in his hands, Gabriel did not understand why he had started working on the construction site. He had already forgotten what his task was. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by Royd, who was running to the servant. He handed Xavier some seeds and ordered him to plant them from there. But he asked why he had to do this, since he was a knight. However, when the royal explained that he would protect the estate from pests, the knight agreed. Xavier sat silently over the beds, watering the planted seeds. At this time, he was thinking that the owner had interrupted him again, and that next time he would have to get away with it in some way. Suddenly the man heard the Baron's voice behind him. He approached the servant with his wife, and said that all the townspeople had probably heard about the rice farms. Everyone thought it was a real miracle. The laborers were happy to see the rice farms expanding. When the swarm passed by, the men looked at it with respect. Messenger reported that the townspeople were showing their admiration for the miracle he had created. The swarm received plus 450 points for his significant success in the community. The total number of his RP was 1,281 points. Hearing this, the swarm smiled with satisfaction and walked on, with a shovel on his shoulder. It was already evening, and small insects were fluttering in the air above the farm. The first stalks of plants began to sprout in the beds. Xavier watched this process with interest, keeping the watering can at the ready. And when he noticed the growth of the plants, he was happy about it. In a moment, the owner came up to him and said that everything would be ready as soon as they put the water wheel in place. After all, during the rains, the water would need to go somewhere so that it would not flood their land. However, to realize this, they needed a specialist. Suddenly, the men's conversation was interrupted by an incomprehensible roar behind them. An army of horsemen in suits was moving toward them. Royd wondered who they were. One of the guests was the Viscount Racona, whose estate was located to the north of this swamp. In a moment, the horse's rearing was very close. A moment later, one of the men stopped near the swarm and asked which of them was responsible for this construction. Xavier was angry at the man's rudeness, but the swarm immediately replied that he was responsible. The man asked them sternly if they knew that the land belonged to the Vicente of Racona, and so he ordered the bewildered men to leave the area immediately. This place was abandoned several hundred years ago. The northern lands were under the rule of the Viscount Racon, and the southern part of the marshes belonged to the frontiersmen. It was obvious that he had decided to assert his rights for a reason. After all, the Viscount probably wanted to take possession of these fertile lands. I knew that he could really insist on transferring the land to his use, because the northern part of the land belonged to the Viscount. The man smiled, because that was the case until recently. Royd asked the guests if they really thought they had entered his territory without permission. The riders sternly confirmed this, because the king himself had given them the land. In response, the Royd decided to close his mouth to the Viscount's servant so that the conversation could be conducted between people of the same status. This position impressed and puzzled the rider. All the workers stopped working to understand what was happening. The Viscount was also a bit surprised by the man's position. After a moment, the Royd apologized and introduced himself as the eldest son of the Frontera family and made a respectful bow. The Viscount mentioned that the man had behaved in a disgraceful manner, so he refused to speak to him and ordered him to call his father. Gabriel said that this was rude of the Viscount, but for the swarm, it was not offensive. The rider asked if they had heard their demand to call Baron Frontera. The swarm calmly replied that they had heard them perfectly. Blowing the dirt off his finger, the man clarified that he had only heard the buzzing of a compost fly. The vicar began to turn his head in different directions to see the fly with his own eyes. The window servant explained to his master that he had just been insulted. The Viscount was shocked because he did not notice it right away. After that, the swarm said that according to Article 321 of the royal law, they had the right to cultivate the marshland. The words of the swarm really hurt the Viscount. The young Frontiero went on to say that in accordance with this article, they could establish ownership of the land. The Viscount tried to silence the man, but he continued. After all, no one has lived or grown any crops on these lands for the past 100 years. Therefore, as a result of all of the above, the ownership was transferred to those who began to cultivate the land. Firstly, the man explained that they had already invested their money and labor in the land. Secondly, it was possible to build houses for people on this land. Third, they planned to develop long-term agriculture in the future. And the last fourth thing that the man wanted to add was that when he approached the beds, Royd grabbed one of the bulbs by the stem and pulled it up to get it out of the ground. Holding the bulb in his hand, the man reinforced his ownership by saying that he had already harvested the first crop from the farm. All these arguments made the Viscount very angry. At that moment, Gabriel remembered the words of his host, when he had handed him a bag of seeds and asked him to plant them in that place to protect himself from various pests. At the same moment, the swarm congratulated the men on witnessing the first harvest in the Mara's marshes. The man decided not to charge them for this spectacle because they were not such greedy people. Mad sparks of incredible anger and shock flew behind the Viscount. The man did not understand how this fool knew everything. Had he prepared in advance? As a gift, Royd decided to give the crocodile's vicar the first onion. And then the man looked at the guests with a satisfied expression. And then he sternly asked the guests to leave their territory. Gritting his teeth, the Viscount had to agree with the man. In a moment, the horsemen were heading in the direction of their estate and left the territory of the Royd farm, leaving only dust from the horses' hooves. Xavier asked the owner how he knew that these people would come to them. However, the young frontiersman replied that he had seen such clever people before, trying to make a quick buck off of other people's labor. At the same moment, the workers standing behind him rejoiced loudly. because their young master was able to protect their land from these people. The men proudly raised their hands to the sky and rejoiced in praise of their master. The young front turned silently to the workers, listening to their positive shouts. And at the same moment, the man asked them where he was going to get the money to pay them for their work and ordered them to get back to work quickly. Soon, heavy rains poured down on the farmland. All the water was collected in an artificially created canal for rainwater drainage. The young frontline workers sat silently in the rain in the middle of the beds and thought about something. Summer ended and autumn came, and with it the rains. The water wheel worked tirelessly to collect water during the downpour. Roy used the simulation 100 times, but it was too early for him to relax. He wanted to be completely confident in the fertility of the soil in the mares. Taking care of his master's well-being, Xavier kept an umbrella over his head. After the rain, the sun's rays began to peek out from the clouds, illuminating the dew droplets on the leaves of the trees. There was almost no water left in the drainage canal after the downpour. Xavier unfolded his umbrella and watched the farm with the owner. The messenger told the man that he had acquired new knowledge in the field of monumental construction. As a result, he left an important mark on the civil engineering of the continent of Lorraine. And as a reward, he was to gain great experience. Roy received increased measurement levels and underground scanning skills, land value estimation, modeling mode, and other skills that were valuable to him. After that, the man got to his feet from the wet grass. At the same time, he learned that the level of sympathy for him had increased from Baron, Baroness, Xavier, Byron, and the townspeople. The total number of his RP was 1,355 points. When the sun fully emerged from behind the clouds, the man said that everything was ready, and it was time to move on to the next step. Meanwhile, back in Raccoon's domain, the servant informs the Viscount about the reclamation of the land. As a result, they will be exempt from taxation for 3 years, and will not have to leave the land. The man could not believe that in the next 2 years the royal family and their workers would be cultivating the land. Instead, the marshes of the mares would become a gold mine for the young frontline soldier. At the same moment, the man's stomach twisted because this was his part of the land. He decided that he would not give it up at any cost. So he turned to his servant and asked him to call a meeting. A few days later, the sun shone brightly on the Fronter's estate. Roy woke up with a severe headache. He thought it was because he had been overworked lately, but in a moment he was on his feet, because he had a lot of work to do. The master called out to Xavier to wake up, and soon he was surprised to see his servant. He looked very tired and said that he also had a headache. At first Roy did not understand what was wrong, but then his face changed to a negative expression. That same day Roy and Xavier went out into the city and found that Baron Emily's cleaning lady, Farmer Alof and his family, and the boy Mikhail had headaches. They also noticed that all the animals had been avoiding the water since yesterday. Comparing all the complaints from people and the suffering of animals, the man realized that the problem was water. One of the most powerful weapons he could use in this world was the information from the book about the Steel Knight. However, after the incident with the giant ants, he realized that events that were not in his book could be happening now. Since Roy expected resistance from Viscount, he decided to make some inquiries about him. The young frontman learned that the main source of income for the Lacona region was their secret technology for dyeing things. And the same technology was used to color fruit. At that moment, the man realized the situation and realized who the culprit was. Meanwhile, in Frontera's estate, the Viscount's servant met with the Baron and told Frontera that if they gave half of the swamps to them, they would stop spoiling their water. The Baron was angry to hear the threat and said he would sue them, but the Lacona representative said it would take at least 2 years to get a verdict, and they doubted their town would last that long, given the legal fees and drinking water charges. After a long discussion, the Viscount's servant stood up to leave, but the Baron told him that they would not give up a single piece of land for him. At this moment, Royd enters his father's room to discuss with his father the necessary measures to improve the water situation in their town. The Viscount's servant, whom Royd accidentally hit with the door, was angry because he had insultingly called his master a parasite. The young frontier boy was surprised that the servant of this parasite understood human language. After these words, the Viscount's knight challenges him to a duel. But Royd immediately knocked his opponent down, not allowing him to get to his feet. The servant asked him to stop and not to hurt him anymore. The outcome of the duel was the same as with Newman. Royd completely defeated him and kept beating him, even though he had given up. The Baron was happy to see his son's success, but Xavier saw his master so happy for the first time. In the evening, Viscount's servant returned to his manor to tell his master of his defeat. When he came to his mansion all beaten up, the Viscount was at first angry with him. But then he thought about an idea and came to the conclusion that the beating of his servant could serve as a good excuse to soothe him for assaulting a nobleman. By doing so, he intended to drag out the proceedings and clarification of the circumstances for 3 or even 4 years. But Royd already knew what the Viscount was thinking and decided to make the first move. The man told his workers that he would not let their efforts go to waste. Royd promised to protect their land from the greedy hands of their enemies. And at that moment all the people supported the position of the owner. First of all, they planned to make a reservoir as a temporary solution to the problem with drinking water. Hippo, the hippo, who was now at the 3rd level of his skills, could help them with this. But their main and more sustainable goal was to build a canal from the West Mountain Water Lake Kapua, which was located in their territory. The construction would be very difficult, but it would indirectly bring them dozens or even hundreds of times more profit than they expected. Several months passed. The Viscount was extremely angry and disappointed, and did not know how it all happened. The man was desperate and nervously thinking about what to do next. That's when his servant told him that the Baron's eldest son wanted to talk to him. But the Viscount ordered him to get out of his estate. The servant explained that Frontera had come to stop the Viscount's worries. A moment later, Royd entered the study with Gabriel and began to mock him, saying that he had turned very pale. But then, the man told Viscount that he could solve their problem. The latter, however, did not understand what problem Frontera's son was talking about. And then Royd arrogantly asked Viscount if he was aware of the latest events. After all, Royd could have saved his dying workshop for painting things and fruits. For a moment, the Viscount blushed and realized that, as he had expected, it was Royd who had destroyed his workshop. The man said that they had done a lot of work to solve their water problem, because at first they did not realize that it was his work. After all, because the Viscount had spoiled their water, they had to get it from the mountain lake Kapua. In general, they had to dig the land from the Kapua River to their estate. They also had to process it and fill it up. The Viscount was very angry and asked how all this was connected to his workshop. But Royd decided to tell him everything in order. So when they were building a water supply system, they came across a huge valley. Standing in the middle of their path, they had no choice but to build a Roman aqueduct. Then, to find limestone as a resource, they carried out blasting operations. But because of this, limestone began to settle at the bottom of the valley in an unintended way. A very large amount of limestone ended up at the bottom of the valley. Then the Viscount interrupted his opponent again to find out how this affected his workshop. In response, the man explained that it was the water from the valley that flowed in the direction of the Viscount's workshop, and that the limestone ingredient had turned his fabric the color of feces. Then the Viscount was completely outraged and threatened Royd with legal action. But Royd reacted calmly to this, because he had to wait at least 2 years for a court decision, and by then no one would even remember his workshop or his product. The Viscount was amazed at this wise act from this small-minded man. However, while Royd was listening to the Viscount's threats that he had connections at the royal court and would make him pay twice as much for the damage he had caused him, The man simply waved his hand at him in silence and left the estate. It was a pleasant autumn day outside. Xavier asked him what was the point of this meeting, because all he had done was to make him even angrier. Xavier also said that this man knew many aristocrats in the city, and if a lawsuit started they would lose even more money. Royd understood his anxiety and told him to wait a while to see who would lose more. Exactly a month later, Count Racona arrived at the Fronter's estate. He literally knelt before Royd and asked him to save the almost bankrupt workshop. Royd looked down on the Viscount. After all, his friends at the royal court could not help him. The only choice he had was to tearfully beg the young Royd to revive his workshop. However, the man did not want to hear any apologies. He wanted him to sign a contract with him for a fixed fee. Thus, he promised to restore his workshop in a week. But when the Count saw the terms of the contract, he was very puzzled by the price. The Viscount said that it made no sense to put such a high price on water, which was already so expensive. Royd replied that it was the Viscount who taught him how to set the price of water. The Count was extremely shocked by what he heard. After signing the contract, young Frontera gave the papers to the Baron, who was also shocked to see how much money they would receive each month. After all, with such a sum of money, from which he could easily pay his monthly debt, he would still have enough money left over for himself. Royd happily remarked that the Count was very kind and quite gracious to sign this contract. Xavier knew that it was the Viscount who had started this war between them, and Royd was doing all this for the estate, but at this point he began to look like a real bad guy who wanted the Count to suffer. In addition, the contract with the Viscount did not specify a deadline, which meant that the owner was going to eat him for generations, if possible. The Baron interrupted his son's fantasies by asking if he was all right, and after a positive answer, he told his son another good news, that Count Cremo offered a good price for the treasures he received from the orc tribe. Royd wondered why he was buying them at such an attractive price. But his father explained that the buyer was planning to make a huge bronze statue out of their treasures instead. Wanted to make a huge bronze statue. In the middle of the ocean was the trading city of Count Cremo. Then the man stood in the middle of the room and looked out the window at the ocean. A strange water vortex appeared in the seemingly quiet ocean. It seemed to the man as if something was coming out of the ocean. And in a moment, his feelings came true as a huge red creature with many teeth emerged from the water. Cremo looked sternly into its eyes through his window. It was a monstrous titan named Giga. Meanwhile, at the Frontier's estate, Xavier told the Baron that in 2 weeks they were leaving for a business trip with a team of 10 men. Arcos agreed with his son's decision and continued to cut branches on the bushes. Seeing his mood, Xavier was worried about his master and assured him that he would be with Royd all the time. The Baron told the knight that he would have given everything for Racon out of fear if it hadn't been for Royd, because he had been a very incompetent and insecure man and leader before. But Xavier reminded him of how he had picked him up in the winter when he found the future servant on the street. But the Baron said he had no motivation to do something like that with such unremarkable qualities. After all, a true leader had to have strong faith and a steely character, just like Royd is now. Xavier thought to himself that Royd's only motivation was money, but decided not to tell his master. It was then that the Baron ordered Xavier not only to protect Royd in the future, but also to be always close to the Baron's descendant. Xavier was embarrassed at first, but immediately agreed to fulfill the Baron's request. Royd could revive the estate, but Xavier could never like a man like Royd. When Xavier was still a child, the Baron asked him what he wanted to become, and he replied that he wanted to become a knight who would protect him from everyone. The Baron was pleased to hear this. He told Xavier that a boy who survived the harsh winter alone would definitely become the strongest knight. Then the Baron gave him a wooden sword that he had carved from a log himself. But this wooden sword was soon broken into pieces by the past Royd, who mocked and insulted the boy. Soon Gabriel returned to the manor. He looked up at the wall where his little broken sword hung and continued to think that he would never like a man like Royd. Entering his master's room, Royd thanked Gabriel for once again choosing to use his engineering lullaby. Xavier was bored listening to the same thing over and over again, so he asked him to hurry up and start, thinking that he should hate Royd, but for some reason he continued to see him as a different person. Xavier continued to beat himself up and eventually fell asleep. It was late at night, and the moon was shining through the windows of the Fronter's mansion. While they were both sleeping soundly, a man with a sword and a black cloak climbed through the window into the room, intent on ending Royd right then and there. The unknown man pulled out his sword and whispered that it was Royd's fault. At the same moment, the man jumped out of the window at the young frontline soldier. His sword flew rapidly toward the man's chest. But suddenly Xavier woke up and immediately jumped up to stop the criminal. With one swift movement, Gabriel cut the offender's sword in half. He was shocked by the servant's reaction. Royd woke up at the same time. He got out of bed and saw that Gabriel was sitting on the floor holding a strange man in dark clothes by the head. The next morning, the men continued to work on the water pipe. He asked the workers what was the most important thing in the operation of any enterprise. The workers told him that the most important thing was safety. Xavier went to the owner and told him that he had informed the Crayfish Knight about the night's incident. It was the right decision. After all, this man was a servant of the Viscount whom he most likely fired primarily because of the high cost of water. Royd said that he would have done the same if he had been paid good money and had not fulfilled his duties. That's why this man attacked him, because all short-sighted people are similar. Xavier asked if the owner knew this would happen. He wondered how Royd could always foresee certain events but never prepare for them. The young frontier looked silently at the servant and pretended that he did not understand what he was talking about. After all, why did he need to prepare for anything if Xavier was always there? Gabriel was very touched by his master's words. Royd added that he was still alive only because Xavier was there at the right time. It showed his reliability and endurance as a knight. After all, not every young boy could survive the winter alone without any help. And it was this person who was able to become a knight who was with him at that time. Who else could he have trusted? Xavier was genuinely impressed and surprised by his host's position. The two men looked at each other in silence. After a few minutes, the swarm became silent, and he asked the servant to finally say a word. Gabriel hesitated and did not know what to say in response. Xavier said only the word wow. But then he hated himself inside. Then Royd lost it for a moment and patted the servant's shoulder in a friendly way to encourage him. Xavier hated himself for thinking Royd was a good man. Then the messenger told the man that at that moment Xavier got rid of a long-standing resentment in his heart. His level of interest in his host increased by 15 points. Royd also received 320 PTS for improving his interpersonal relationships. His total score was 1,675 points. He planned to complete the construction of their water supply pipe the next day. So it was time to go to the creamery to get a decent amount of money. The next day, the weather was gloomy in the autumn forest. Meanwhile, Royd and his crew marched forward on the trail. The young front man was dozing sweetly sitting behind Xavier, who was up on his horse. Suddenly, his master's head tilted to the side, causing him to wake up immediately. He thought that Gabriel had hit him then. However, Xavier said that he did nothing of the sort. Royd assumed that the servant had hit him because Xavier was annoyed that a nobleman like him did not ride and slept on the move. But the servant denied any accusations from his master. Suddenly, the young frontier ordered him to stop. At the same moment, the man quickly got down from his horse and asked Xavier to teach him how to ride. However, Gabriel refused, explaining that he was a knight and not a riding teacher. The messenger translated the servant's explanation as admiration for the fact that the master was trying to learn something new and necessary. But Royd said it was an order. Instead, The messenger translated it as a sincere request for training addressed to Xavier. Then the messenger tried to translate all the men's words into actual words, which eventually drove Royd crazy. For a moment, Gabriel thought that the host had lost his mind. The messenger also said that rumors spread faster than words. Specifically, rumors that he had built the first water supply system on the continent. As a result, his reputation as a builder has increased. And later his name would be written in the history of construction of the kingdom and the entire continent. For this, the man received 600 bonus RPs. His total score was 2,275 points.